O Kali Gumapak Ko'u Inoa. My name's Kali. This is our second educational conference, and it's really nice to see new faces that we did not see at the first conference. And the purpose of these conferences is to provide experts who are able to talk to you with all of their research and share their research that they have been able to do in sharing it with everybody else around the islands as well as the rest of the world. Most importantly, I would like to thank the members of Aha Kanaka Moku'oke'awe, because without the guys that helped to prepare all of this, it would have been very, very, very difficult for us to put on. And I'm very proud of them because we did not go out to get funding from any source, like Office of Hawaiian Affairs and everybody else that, you know, we just dug down deep, had Kalua Pig and Laulau fundraising sales to raise our own money so that we would be able to bring these experts here to share them with you, you know, so that our educational conference could not be tainted. Okay, and so I'm very, very proud of our guys. They're not here because they're working. They're bringing together the Laulau plate lunch that we're going to be serving this morning. Bobby and Trudy Yamada, and it was really good over at Bobby's house because that's where we made the 1,400 laulaus that we made for the fundraiser, and then last night another 300 laulaus for us to make for this event today. And there's Cookie and Norman Gaspar, who's in the kitchen cooking, all the way from Honoka'a. Then also in the kitchen, Paniolo, Ralph Kahele, and he's the guy that is the mastermind behind all the good food. Then Dominique Stein, she couldn't make it this morning, but she will be coming. She's the one that provided all of our posters, advertising, and so forth. And she's also a concert promoter, so we were really lucky to get her on with us. Keone Kalave. And Keone has been really instrumental in making sure that we stay on the straight and narrow, yeah? Especially with his expertise on cultural protocol. La'akea Carvalho, the guy carrying the chair. You know, if you have kids coming to an after-school program, this is the place to send them. I'm serious. Because La'akea is the head for the program here. And the programs that I've seen the kids go through is just really, really, really awesome that he's put together. And anytime that you can support, or better yet, just bring your kids and turn them over to La'akea, because when you get the kids back, they're going to be really good. You know, so La'akea and his staff are doing a really, really good job at teaching the kids. We also have, and they're not here, they're sick today, Peter and Adele Velasco. They're our kupuna, and they helped us quite a bit. And our Speedy Gonzalez, Marianne Farrell, she's driving around, shuttling people from the airport. So we have a lot of people involved, you know, in this. And so we invite you, if you have time, to please come and join us, because Aha Kanaka Moku'oke'awe is there to help to protect our assets, both from Mauka to Makai. All of our resources from Mauka to Makai, and to be able to stand up and speak in support or speak in opposition to things that will affect all of us, you know, here on the Aina. And so we'd like to invite you to join us when and where you can. Our first presenter is going to be Dr. Keanu, and he's going to be speaking from 9 to 10:30. Then from 10:30 to 11 will be a question and answer session. Then at 11 o'clock to 12 noon, we're going to break for lunch. And they're going to be serving lunch right at the breezeway right out here. Okay, and the lunch that they'll be serving, again, we're trying to raise money, so it's $10 for a laulau plate. That includes rice, mac salad, chicken long rice, sweet potato, and haupia. And it's going to be one of the massive laulaus that they make. Okay, so it's going to be served right out there. And you can bring your plate back in here, sit down, talk story, okay? The monies that are raised, the excess monies that we are able to come out with, we're going to be using it for the next conference. And the next conference we have scheduled is going to be La Ho'i Ho'i Ea. Okay, you know what day that is? La Ho'i Ho'i Ea. Okay, it's July 31st. Okay, and La Ho'i Ho'i Ea is when the British returned the Hawaiian Kingdom back to Kamehameha III. And so that is a major Hawaiian Kingdom holiday. So we're holding conferences to honor those two major holidays, La Kuʻokoʻa, which is November 28th, which is our Hawaiian Independence Day, and La Ho'i Ho'i Ea, July 31st, when the Hawaiian Kingdom was returned back to Kamehameha III. So that's going to be our next conference. And we've already lined up some really, really good presenters for that conference. Okay, after lunch, 12 noon, Kauʻisai will be here. Kauʻisai Durua. And she's going to be talking about Timoteo Ha'alilio. How many of you know who Timoteo Ha'alilio is? Okay, good, because a lot of you don't. Well, after you hear what Kauʻi has to present, you will know who he is and honor him with the greatest respect and what he was able to accomplish. I'm very excited that there's many of you who haven't heard of Ha'alilio, Timoteo Ha'alilio. At 2 o'clock, we have Dr. Ron Williams, who will be presenting and sharing his manao and his latest research. And this guy, every time I see him on Facebook, I tell you, he's pulling up just choke information. And it's like the Hawaiian Encyclopedia of Knowledge that he keeps pumping out on Facebook. And so when I saw him this morning, he said, I'm not doing the same presentation I did the last time. All the stuff I'm doing is all new. Okay, so it's going to be really good. I'm very excited about that. Then at 4 o'clock, we're going to have all the presenters come back up. Okay, and we're going to have a town hall format where we'll be able to you'll be able to ask questions, and they'll be able to answer your questions. So save up your questions. Throughout their presentation, at the end of their presentations, we will have question and answers. So I ask that during their presentation, hold your questions, please. And don't interrupt their presentation, and wait until after their presentation is completed, and then we'll get into the question and answers, because we're not going to try to control questions or whatever, but just hold it so that they can do their presentation, then at the end, ask the questions, okay? Again, mahalo to our executive chefs. They're not here. They're still cooking. And Ralph Kahele and Norman Gaspar. And Bobby Yamada, who is the chief of staff in the kitchen. And, of course, the support team with Cookie Gaspar and Marianne Farrell and Trudy. Okay. Also, if you take a look at Cookie's t-shirt, okay, we just got those printed up. And I used to wear a t-shirt. I swear, I must have had the only t-shirt like that on the island. And every time I went around and I wore it, somebody would always come up and say, "Where did you get that? I'll buy one." Okay, so Cookie said, we're going to print some up and see if anybody would be interested in buying a t-shirt. And if you do, that money is going to be used for our educational conferences. Okay? So, enough of the, it's not a paid political announcement, but enough of the announcements. So what I'd like to do is introduce our first presenter. I've known him for several years. I'd like to say that I've known him ever since we were at Kamehameha School, but I didn't, because he was still, I think, in kindergarten or something when I was going to Kamehameha School. And, he always says that I'm his upperclassman. But with the research that he has been able to do, and all of the information that he has been able to provide, and the dedication that he has had, he has really transformed what has taken place here in Hawaii with all of us. Our terminology that we're now using, our understanding of what happened, in the past, so that we can now literally apply it today. And I'm very, very proud to know him. And the time that we met was literally because I needed help in filing a contested case hearing with DLNR, because I filed a contested case when they wanted to build this fish farm right off the Kohala coast. And the fish farms, when we did the research, was really pilau. And yet they had a bunch of guys from America that wanted to come, because Hawaii is the only state that doesn't have any laws that bans fish farming. And so they saw an open door, came in. So I needed legal help. So in talking to all my friends at that time, this guy's name kept coming up. Keanu. Keanu. I said, well, who's Keanu? We don't know, but we know he's good, and he's going to the university. He almost passed with his doctorate degree. So finally I went online, and I saw that he had posted his dissertation. You all need to read his dissertation. Take time to read it. Because after I read it, it's about 380 pages, maybe 400 pages. I couldn't put it down. I stayed up the entire night and read it. And after I read it, I said, this is the guy. So I had to go meet him. The following week, he was going to be at a forum at UH Manoa, Hawaiian Studies class. So I flew over, parked my car, and as I was coming out of the parking garage, who should be walking down the sidewalk? Keanu. And I yelled, Keanu, like I know him. I didn't even know who he was, or he knows who I am. And he looked at me like with a funny look, like, oh, bro, what woods did you come out of? And so I ran up to him and I introduced myself, and I said, I need your help. And I told him what was going on, and he said, come, let's continue walking, because he had to go to the presentation. By the time we got there, he said yes, he would help. And so we drafted the opposition in the contested case hearing. And so, as you know, there's no fish farm along the Kohala coast. Okay, so, and that was the beginning of our relationship. And it continues today. And I can say that we're very good friends, to the point where every time he brings a poke home, he always calls me, bro, I got the poke. I'd like to introduce my friend, Dr. David Keanu.
Well, since Kali took about 20 minutes, we're going to go 20 minutes over my time allotted. Aloha. So I'm going to have to talk from behind here, because if I'm in the front, you're going to get feedback. So I'll be pacing over here. Let me make sure that thing doesn't pop up again. Okay. Okay, how's everybody? How was Thursday? Notice I didn't say Thanksgiving, huh? Do you guys know why Thanksgiving? I didn't say Thanksgiving here in Hawaii. No, because that's an American holiday. It's called Pilgrims. Yeah, the Mayflower. They didn't come to Hawaii. They ended up on the east coast of the United States. I saw a presentation, well, I saw actually a show on CNN, no, MSNBC, and it was a British Broadcasting Corporation, a BBC commentator. And they asked the commentator, because she's in America, in New York, who cooks for Thanksgiving? Do you cook? And she said, no, but I do cook for Christmas. And then the guy goes, oh, I forgot. When I was in Great Britain, I asked them, how do you folks, well, what do you call Thanksgiving in Great Britain? And they said, Thursday. So I learned something from that. So now when I ask, I say, hey, happy Thursday, you know, how was your turkey? But the holiday that we should be thinking more about is Independence Day, November 28th. And that's what we're going to kind of talk about a bit today. That's pretty much the theme of these next 2 days. So before we get into my topic, my discussion, a little background about myself. So I'm a graduate of Kamehameha Schools, graduated back in 1982. So that's why Cully is an upperclassman. He's a 69 grad. So when he said when he graduated, I was actually 5 years old. Yeah, no, 69. Yeah, yeah. So after Kamehameha Schools, I went on to a military college, New Mexico Military Institute. That's where I got my commission as a second lieutenant in the Army, called the Early Commissioning Program. And then I went off to the University of Hawaii, got my bachelor's, graduated back in 1987. And then I went off and played Army. So I was in the National Guard. I was on both active and reserve. After 10 years of service, retired in 1994. So I was honorably discharged. For myself, I'm not anti-American. I'm not anti-military. I'm just saying this isn't America, and the military shouldn't be here. That's just how it is. As we used to say in the military, things weren't done according to the regulations. What I'm doing is bringing back attention to the regulations. What actually governs or rules this system, yeah? So, many people have seen that when I speak, I don't get angry. Pretty much even-keeled. I just present the facts the way it is, because that's really all you can do, right? This is not rallying the troops to get people to believe you. All I'm basically saying is, this is coffee in a white cup. It's not Coca-Cola in a glass. That's all I do, right? And that's what gets everybody some people a little perturbed, because their whole life investment was in the belief that this was Coca-Cola with in a glass, when in fact it's not. So I found that when I came to the realization of this information, I would say probably about 1992, that's when it hit me from doing my own research. And it really just started off real simple. I just wanted to know my genealogy. In fact, my tutu told me I better know my genealogy. She actually had me promise her before she passed away. And that was back in 1984. I didn't take her up on that until 1992. And as I began to look into my genealogy, I wanted to know who these people were. I wanted to know who my great-grandfather was. Born in Napo'opo'o, Kaikolu Church, that's where they're all buried, Simerson, Ohana. I wanted to know, where did the Simerson come from? That was my great-great-grandfather, who was half native, half English. Then I wanted to know further back, all the way back to Umeʻaliloa. Then I wanted to know who was Liloa. So that took me into original source information as much as I could in the archives. But as far as the ancient chiefs from the 1400s, began to read a lot of Samuel Kamakau, John E. Kepelino, just to understand that time frame. Yeah, because obviously we didn't have records back then. And then the conclusion that I came to when I started to look into this history was this Hawaii is not what I was taught. This Hawaii was not the Hawaii that I learned at the University of Hawaii. It wasn't the Hawaii I learned at the Kamehameha schools. The history that I was taught was the 19th century was like trying to be something that we weren't. It was as if the missionaries came, controlled everyone, and they created the Hawaiian Kingdom for their benefit. And I found that was completely false, completely false. And I found out that the missionaries who arrived in 1820, they weren't the cause of what happened in 1893. It was their grandchildren and their children. So this whole idea of anti-missionaries is completely off base. In fact, the ones in 1893, let's say the son of a missionary, Sanford Dole, he wasn't a missionary. He was a judge on the Hawaiian Kingdom Supreme Court. Lauren Thurston, the grandson of a missionary, Asa Thurston, he was a lawyer, and he was an elected representative in the House of Representatives. So when I started to look at this, I also could only use the tools that I had to interpret these things. And that was my military training as an officer. And I began to see things in a different light. So when they said that the Hawaiian government was overthrown, or the Hawaiian Kingdom was overthrown in 1893, I clearly saw that you got to distinguish between what was overthrown and what remained. What was overthrown was the government through military force, which I'm going to get into. But the overthrow of government does not mean you can overthrow a country. See, in the military, we knew that. That's why you go to war. You basically subdue the other side, meaning you overthrow that government, force them into a treaty of surrender, and then later a treaty of peace. So I knew that you couldn't overthrow a country by overthrowing a government, but I knew there was a government that was overthrown in 1893. So my thought there was, wait a minute, then the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists. And when I say Hawaiian Kingdom, I'm not talking about a sovereignty group today, because you got multiple groups claiming to be something that I want to be blunt, they're not. What I'm talking about is a country. The country called the Hawaiian Kingdom that my great-grandparents were born in. So in 1880, their country was called the Hawaiian Kingdom, their country. Today, I'm just recovering my memory of that kingdom, because they're not here to tell me how it was. I can only look at the records. And that's when it opened my eyes. Then I got to the point, well, how did Hawaii get annexed? How did Hawaii become a part of the United States? Because I have a vested interest in this. I'm an officer in the Army. We do training in Korea. Back then it was called Team Spirit. And then when that balloon goes up, we fire live rounds. That's not a problem. I had no problem with that. The problem I had was I might die for a country, not mine. Now that was my problem. Then I started thinking about my uncles in Vietnam getting drafted. And then watching my uncle suffering from PTSD from Vietnam and marching up and down our lane in Kuʻokoʻa, just going crazy. These are the things that started to make me re-examine my assumptions. So then how did Hawaii become a part of the United States? I need to know that, because I already know Hawaii is not part of the United States in the 19th century, 1800s. How did it become a part of the United States? And then during the Spanish-American War, I found out that Congress passed a law annexing Hawaii. Now, I knew as an officer, I'm not even poli-sci back then, political science. I'm not even a lawyer or know anything about law. But I knew a law of America cannot annex a foreign country. That's like saying the United States today could annex Korea tomorrow. Cannot. Period. It's not an argument. And then I found out that all you have since then were American laws passed by Congress. And today we have the state of Hawaii by virtue of the Statehood Act of 1959. That's another American law. That was when I came to that stark reality, I'm in the wrong army. And I got to retire. So after 10 years service, moved on. Not a problem. I wasn't angry. In fact, I had a discussion with my battalion commander. I said, sir, you're not going to believe what I'm finding. I need to find more answers. And he said, Keanu, go ahead. Because I already served my 6 years obligation. That was my contract when I got my commission. 4 years more, that was just voluntary. I would have loved to stay in. Good pay, commissary, PX. But then I had to address things bigger than me. And that's when I started to walk this talk. So from then until now, you can say that my information that I researched has become refined. It's precision. Now, I'm the so-called expert in this area because of my PhD. Now, my PhD is in political science. It's not in Hawaiian studies. Okay? My master's in political science. I specialized in international relations and public law. So I'm not a cultural guy, right? Personally, I am, but I don't come across as a cultural guy from my academic side. My academics is purely poli-sci, and I call a spade a spade. And that's just the way it is. That's how I used to be in the Army, but you know, you don't get angry and say, hey, don't tell me this is Coca-Cola in a glass. This is coffee in a white cup. So with that premise, I wanted to get into this topic today called state of war, okay? Now, state of war, those are heavy words. You gotta be careful how you use that, right? I'm gonna show you that we are in a state of war, not because me, but because of what President Cleveland concluded back in 1893. So the first thing we're gonna look into is this accomplishment this past summer. And this is the Hawaii State Teachers Association. And this is really important. Now, I found out about this. What was the backing behind it? In that picture, if you... Okay. Okay. So, see this woman right here? Her name is Amy Peruso. Now, Amy Peruso, when I knew her, she had a master's degree in political science. And I met her at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, political science department. She's very good friends with Umi Perkins, who's a faculty at the Kamehameha schools, who teaches history. He has a PhD in political science. I believe Amy also has a PhD, okay? So it says here that they basically got this convention, this annual conference. I heard it was over thousands of delegates there. They got them to pass a resolution which says the NEA will publish an article that documents the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893, the prolonged illegal occupation of the United States in the Hawaiian Kingdom, and the harmful effects that this occupation has had on the Hawaiian people and the resources on the land. And this is from the Hawaii State Teachers Association Facebook. It goes on to say that mahalo to Chris Santamaro, that's Chris right here, a teacher at Kaneohe Elementary, who introduced the proposal, and Uluhane Wai Ale Ale, and that's Uluhane, a teacher at Kuala Pu'u Charter School in Molokai, whose impassioned and articulate argument in favor of the Hawaiian overthrow measure swayed a majority of teachers from across the country to support it. That's really big. Now the point is, what prompted them to do that? So I called my friend Amy. I said, first of all, congratulations. Congratulations on an unbelievable accomplishment. How did you do that? You to get American teachers to say that Hawaii is illegally occupied by the United States. She told me that because Amy is the secretary/treasurer of the Hawaii State Teachers Association. So she's an official of the union. And she says that, and she's been using my book, Ua Mau Ke'ea, to teach, which is a watered-down version of my doctoral dissertation that covers Hawaii's history from Kamehameha I all the way till today. But she would ask teachers, if they're teaching Hawaii's history, what's your resource? What are you using? And that's when she would realize that they're using either outdated resources or not using the resource itself. So she would be introducing my book, Ua Mau Ke'ea. And she said that's what prompted them to do that. And I was like, wow, actually I had a small part in getting that going. But it also shows that the teachers are teaching it. That's what's important. The teachers are teaching it. Okay, now that I can stand in front, I like that. I felt a little boxed in right here. Okay. Now, what we're going to talk about now is we need to break this down. Now, what we have here, this is a given, right? This is not an argument. We're not trying to get the National Education Association to pass a resolution. They already did. And they're going to document the illegal overthrow and the illegal occupation. What I want to do is break that down. What is the illegal overthrow and the illegal occupation? Because occupation only takes place between countries, between independent states, right? It's an international law issue. Now, if we're talking about occupation, we're also talking about war, a state of war. That's the natural deduction, right? Because you cannot have a country occupied if there is no war that exists. You cannot peacefully, belligerently occupy a country. You have to occupy it. Now, when you occupy it, there are certain rules that apply. There are certain rules. And these rules are what we call international law. International law. So, international law, inter means between, right? International law is a law between nations, not above nations, okay? Now, that's very different in a local environment. In a local environment, we are all under the law, subject to the law. At the international level, the law is not above countries, but rather a law between countries. And the sources of international law are called customary, things that are understood to be accepted as what countries can do and cannot do. Then you also have another source of international law called treaties. These are agreements. And these agreements bind the parties that signed it, okay? Which is the evidence of an agreement that's called a treaty. Then you also have principles of international law. Terms such as estoppel, yeah? Terms such as presumption. I'm not going to get into the details of them, but I just want to point out to you, they're different than what we are normally accustomed to when we speak about international law. Now, a lot of us today, we may know some history regarding local law. Yeah, like people would say, oh, quiet title action. Yeah, adverse possession. Okay, presumption of innocence. These are principles that apply within a country, but may not apply between countries. And that's where we have to make that distinction. So my master's degree, specializing in international relations, delved into a lot of those types of terms, right? Very different, very different. So when we speak to international law, we have to speak of it as between countries. Keep that in mind. Meaning people, us, we have no say in international law. Yeah, you may have an opinion, but that opinion means nothing in international law. But if a head of state, a head of a country makes a statement, then that could bind that country under international law. See, that's different. That's different. So when Vladimir Putin says something at the international level, and Trump says something at the international level, that would resonate in international law, whether they put their country in a situation of accountability or not, if they adhere to an agreement or not. Statements that are made at the highest level is also a source of international law, because that who represents the countries. People don't represent countries. Governments do. Okay, so make sense? Okay. So in order to understand occupation, what is that? Well, we have to look at what is international law regarding war. So according to Judge Greenwood, he's from the International Court of Justice, traditional international law was based upon a rigid distinction between a state of peace and the state of war. So you only have these two state of affairs with countries. Because if a country has a dispute with another country, and it's a legitimate dispute, they can actually go to war. And international law will regulate war. See, in the Army, we call it the Hague and Geneva Conventions. Those are international treaties that regulate warfare, okay? The other word that's used is international humanitarian law. Okay, that's laws of war. You always want to be in a state of peace, but it may go to a state of war where there are different rules that apply, okay? So according to Judge Greenwood, there's a rigid distinction. You're either here or you're there, okay? It's like being hapai, right? You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. You're not halfway, right? No difference than countries, you were either in a state of peace or you were in a state of war. There was no intermediate state. And that's important to know. But what's also important to know is that it's not up to us as a people to determine whether or not a state of war exists. And I'm not trying to tell you that I'm interpreting the situation as a state of war. I'm just going to show you that the highest level of government has determined that this is a state of war that Hawaii has been engaged in since 1893. Now, because there was no formal dispute resolution at the international level, as I stated, wars are legal, okay? But it had to be justified. The war has to be justified. You cannot just arbitrarily invade another country, right? The term that is used to apply to justifying warfare is a Latin term called jus ad bellum. Jus ad bellum basically is what justifies warfare. Now, if it is not justified under these rules, basically the rule says you cannot arbitrarily take over another country. You have to do it because there's an unresolved dispute, right? That's the only way that you can have what is called a just war, as opposed to having an unjust war. Now, if you have an unjust war, like how Germany arbitrarily invaded Luxembourg in 1914, that's an unjust war. There was no reason for them to invade other than to use Luxembourg to launch military attacks into France. Luxembourg was a neutral country at that time. That's an unjust war. Now, what international law says is anything deriving from an unjust war is illegal, even though you're in full power and you did what you did. At the end of the war, everything is illegal, okay? Now, if it's a just war, okay? If it's a just war, let's say the United States war against Japan, 1941. When the Japanese attacked the U.S. military in Pearl Harbor and other military installations in the islands, that was considered a just war, United States response. So that's a just war, okay? A recent example of an unjust war is in 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, okay? Which is created Desert Shield, which ultimately became Desert Storm, okay? So that would be considered an unjust war. And Iraq ended up paying reparations. The final reparations that were issued was in 2014, and the total amount of reparations for that unjust war was $45 billion, paid out to 1.5 million individuals, companies, and countries because of that unjust war. So can you understand that you can go to war, but what is crucial is it justified? Okay. So there are 4 stages in war, in international law, okay? The first stage is act of war. There has to be some physical action that will transform the situation, not a statement, but an action, an engagement of military against another country. That's act of war. Once you have an act of war, and that's a trigger word, act of war, you trigger state of war and the new rules. So now the rules under a state of war, there's a term called jus in bello, and that's regulating war. No matter if it's illegal, unjust, or just, it'll regulate it because you're now in a factual situation. Just like what Luxembourg was when Germany invaded them in 1914 during World War I. Now, the second stage of war is surrender. That is when hostilities have stopped, right? But a treaty of surrender does not transform the situation back to a state of peace. It only ends hostilities. And that is normally followed by the third stage, and that's called belligerent occupation. And that's when the country that is the victor will occupy that territory in order to carry out the treaty of surrender. to ultimately lead to the final stage called a treaty of peace. So you need a treaty of peace to transform the situation back to a state of peace. Remember, because you need a treaty, that's an agreement. Okay. Three types of warfare. You have physical warfare, economic, and psychological. Okay, if anybody was in the military, you guys would know that you were trained probably in one or a few of those things. Okay, so that's important. Now, the point that I'm making though is war is legal in international law, but it's regulated. Okay. So let's use these 4 stages to understand how it works in the case of Japan. So Japan, first stage, act of war. That was when Pearl Harbor got attacked. And President Roosevelt publicly pronounced that by an act of war, Japan had invaded the U.S. forces, engaged the U.S. military. And he used the word act of war, a day that will live in infamy. Yeah, remember his talk? He initiated state of war on December 7th, 1941. Now, December 8th is when the U.S. Congress passed the resolution, Declaration of War. But the Declaration of War did not start when they passed the resolution on December 8th. It was actually December 7th. Some people still think, well, Congress has to pass a resolution declaring war in order to make it war. No. Actually, there was a court case in 1946, New York Life Insurance versus Banyan. Banyan was a naval officer who died in Pearl Harbor. And he had an insurance policy, life insurance. And his life insurance policy, there was an exclusion. It did not cover if you died during war. Interesting, huh? Covers every other way of dying except during war. Now, the Banyan family was trying to collect from New York Life Insurance. And their argument was that Congress passed a law on December 8th, declaration of war. Therefore, state of war started on the 8th, not on the 7th, the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked. And the federal judge said, no. When President Roosevelt stated act of war, it triggered state of war December 7th. December 8th, the declaration of war was merely a formality. It was not a prerequisite. And you notice here, the judge said when President Roosevelt proclaimed act of war, not the Congress, because the Congress does not represent the United States in international affairs. The president does. So, second stage, September 1945, surrender. USS Missouri, which is in Pearl Harbor right now, was in Japan. They signed a treaty of surrender. All that did was cease hostilities. That did not transform the situation back to a state of war. Third, from 1945 to 1952, Japan was occupied. General MacArthur was the military governor. And the 25th Infantry Division was one of the units that went to Japan to occupy it, to begin disarming the Japanese forces. A treaty was signed in 1951 in San Francisco, but it wouldn't come into play until 1952. And that is when the Treaty of Peace transformed the situation back to a state of peace. You guys see how the laws of war apply to this case? So it was only after 1952 that you had a state of peace in Japan. Before that was still a state of war. And it was regulated by the laws of occupation. Belligerent occupation. Now let's apply that concept, this theory, to Korea. Okay? Well, North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950. That was an act of war, initiated the war. 1954, after 4 years of fighting, they had a armistice, not a surrender, but an armistice, where they created the 38th parallel as the dividing point. What's supposed to follow this second stage? Occupation. No. What happened was there was no occupation and there was no treaty of peace, which means legally Korea is still in a state of war. And if you go to South Korea and you visit Seoul, it doesn't look like they're in a state of war. They make good bulgogi, good kimchi. You would never guess they're in a state of war. No different than how you would look in Hawaii. But if you go to North Korea, it still looks like a state of war. Now, doesn't this kind of change things as far as a perception of that leader of North Korea? I'm not talking about communism. I'm not talking about anything, but that guy's talking like he's a belligerent. And you know what the problem is? He also announced in 2013, 4 years ago, Hawaii's targeted for nuclear strike. We got drawn into this war when we shouldn't have. Yeah. So that's why it's important for us to know these terms. So when you watch CNN now, I think things will start to make a little bit more sense, yeah, when you watch it. Any questions so far on this? You good? Okay. So now we have to get into the Hawaiian Kingdom. So before we can even talk about state of war, treaty of peace, treaty of surrender, belligerent occupation, anything of these 4 stages, we got to first of all determine whether or not Hawaii is a country. Because if Hawaii wants to become a country, well, then we can't use international law. So you have a few of the sovereignty groups, and in this group I throw in Office of Hawaiian Affairs. Everything is moving toward sovereignty. That's why it's called a sovereignty movement. Everything is moving toward independence. It's an independence movement. That means sovereignty is not a reality. It's an aspiration. If it's an aspiration, we can't use international law. We have to verify whether or not Hawaii is a sovereign state. Now, what's important here is another term that is constantly being misused throughout Hawaii. Now, I teach this at the university. I teach a graduate course in the College of Education where we have a cohort of Kamehameha school teachers, Iolani teacher, and an instructor at the University of Hawaii. And they're getting their master's degree in education. When we started off the class, we just got 1 week left in class. This semester will end December, early December. When I started off the class, all I said was, we will be focusing first on terminology and definitions first, and not operate as if you folks know what you're talking about. And if I ask you, what is independence? I don't want you to say, oh, this is what I think it is. No, it's called look it up. Yeah? Where's the dictionary? We start off with a known point. Once you get into the definitions and terms, then when we talk about a situation, it makes sense. As opposed to trying to explain a situation where people still have local terms, yeah, local understandings. It only creates confusion. So we start off with terminology, right? Like in the military, okay? People may not know that there are 2 M60s, okay? An M60, okay, these are acronyms, okay? So these terms have meaning. Okay, this applies to a tank, right? Or this applies to a machine gun. We know that in the military. But when you have somebody that maybe watched a lot of movies and wanted to be a Rambo, they don't know anything. All they want to know is they like shoot, yeah? They just want to fire off rounds. We have to break it down to basic training. You need to break down the weapon before you can fire it. All these things come into play just like teaching. You need to know the components before you start firing rounds. In this case, you need to know the terms in order to explain things, right? That's what's important. So, the term independence and sovereignty and state. So, a state is a country, okay? Some people call it nation state. But the term used right now is just universal. It's called state. Now, a state, if it's independent, then international law can be used. If you're a state and you're not independent, you can't use international law. So, state of New York, state of New York. The state of New York cannot use international law. But the state of New York is within the United States of America. The United States of America is an independent state. That is the subject of international law, and the United States can use international law. But the state of New York cannot, right? Now, in the 1800s, you had a state, a country called Japan. Japan was a state, but it wasn't recognized as being independent. So what does independent mean? Independence means that only your laws exist over your territory, independent of other laws. That's what independence means. It doesn't mean I'm physically separate from you. That's not independence. Independent state is a state that only its laws apply. Okay, it's called its legal system, right? So Japan, as an example, was a state, but its independence was not recognized. So if let's say an American citizen gets into trouble in Japan in 1890, he could only be prosecuted under American law, not Japanese law. And the consulate in Japan would serve as a court called consular jurisdiction. Now that is clear evidence that America did not recognize Japan's independence. Because if Japan was independent, then that American citizen should have been prosecuted under Japanese law, not American law in Japanese territory. That same principle applied to Siam, which is Thailand, China, Persia, which is Iran today, Ottoman Empire. Okay? Now for Hawaii, we were an independent state. Independent. And that any Hawaiian subject, Hawaiian citizen, gets into trouble in Japan in 1890, they could only be prosecuted under Hawaiian Kingdom law by the Hawaiian consulate, just like the American system, just like the British, just like the French. So even Hawaii did not recognize Japan as an independent state. Japan only became independent where everybody recognized its laws over its territory exclusively was 1899 when they participated in the Hague Conference, which regulated war. That's the Hague Conventions. So let's take a look at independence. So does that make sense when I say independence? So it's not chasing something. You either are or you're not. It's like you're in a state of war or you're in a state of peace. You're either independent or you're not independent. So, Permanent Court of Arbitration in the Netherlands, that's the World Court. It says in the 19th century, the Hawaiian Kingdom existed as an independent state, recognized as such by the United States, Great Britain, and various other states. What does this mean? This means that the United States and Great Britain and other countries recognize Hawaiian independence. What does that mean? Somebody tell me. What does that mean? They are recognizing Hawaiian independence. Exactly. They're recognizing Hawaiian law as independent of any other law. So when the United States says they recognize Hawaiian independence, what they're saying is American citizens in Hawaii in the 19th century will be prosecuted under Hawaiian law, not American law. Make sense? The same thing with the British and the other countries. That's what's important. Now, what's important here today is that Hawaii became an independent state in 1843, November 28th. November 28th. That is when Great Britain recognized Hawaiian independence with France. But the primary country to recognize Hawaii's independence, its separation of its own laws, was Great Britain. Because Hawaii was actually a part of the British Empire since 1794. King Kamehameha I joined the British Empire, not as a colony, but as a component of that empire. He still ran the country, but he recognized King George III as his liege lord. No different than how Kaumuali'i of Kauai recognized Kamehameha as his liege lord, but he allowed him to still run Kauai after 1810, okay? So when Great Britain recognized Hawaiian independence on November 28, that was the most important day in Hawaii's international history. That means Great Britain recognized Hawaii's separation and acknowledged when British subjects are now in Hawaii, they cannot claim protection under British law, under Hawaiian law. That's why we have the Union Jack on the Hawaiian flag when you see it. That Hawaiian flag that flies, the so-called State of Hawaii flag, that's a flag from the Hawaiian Kingdom. It's been there since 1816, with minor adjustments in 1945. But you notice the Union Jack? That's our connection to the British. We didn't need other countries to recognize Hawaiian independence. Once we got Great Britain to recognize Hawaiian independence, then all we did was enter into diplomatic relations with other countries. Not that we needed their recognition. Yeah, so that's important. That's why November 28th was a huge holiday in the 19th century. In fact, 1893 was supposed to be the 50th anniversary. 50th anniversary. Now in 1893, there were only 44 independent states. Only 44. Hawaii was one of them. Okay? And then in 1945, when the UN was formed, there were only 46. Today, we have a total of 193. The balance of the 46 became independent states through decolonization. That's when the British Empire began to be broken up. The French Empire, the United States Empire, and others. The breakup of the Soviet Union also added to the 193 countries. But what's important is, because of Hawaii's independence in 1843, we were part of the original in the 19th century. That's important to know. Very, very important. Okay. And this is the point that I was making about the Hawaiian flag. That flag was formed in 1816 by order of King Kamehameha I. And then Great Britain recognized our independence. That flag is not the state of Hawaii flag. That's the Hawaiian Kingdom flag. Okay. Also by 1893, Hawaii manned over 90 embassies and consulates all over the world. And this is from the letterheads of the legations, which is another word for embassy, and consulate. So here we have a Hawaiian legation, Hawaiian embassy in Washington, D.C. Hawaiian legation in London, an embassy in London. We got a consulate in Bangkok, Siam, that's Thailand. We have a Hawaiian embassy in France. Also an embassy in Amsterdam, Netherlands. Now, I didn't learn any of this stuff when I was at Kamehameha. I didn't learn about anything like this at UH. All I was taught, the Haole came, took over, now we got Hawaiian homes. Real simple history. Now, Kamehameha IV's speech to the legislature in 1855 speaks to this issue of Hawaii being a part of the family of nations. This is at the death of King Kamehameha III. It is gratifying to me, on commencing my reign, to be able to inform you that my relations with the great powers, these are states, between whom and myself exist treaties of amity or goodwill, are of the most satisfactory nature. I have received from all of them assurances that leave no room to doubt that my rights and sovereignty will be respected. Okay, so clearly they are speaking not to becoming independent. He's speaking from a position of being independent, being a sovereign state. Also, Hawaii can claim to have influenced Dr. Sun Yat-sen. He's the father of modern China. And Dr. Sun Yat-sen, he's like the George Washington of America to Chinese. He attended Iolani College and Oahu College, which is what we call Punahou today, from 1879 to 1883. In fact, his brother was a cook at Ulupalakua Ranch on Maui, who brought him to Hawaii to get educated. Because back then, China was an empire, was a dynasty. Okay? This guy started the revolt against that to turn it into a republic. And then he stated to a reporter in Hawaii in 1910, he told a reporter, "This is my Hawaii. Here I was brought up and educated. And it was here that I came to know what modern civilized governments are like and what they mean." He didn't learn about civilized governments in America, and he didn't learn about civilized governments in China. He learned it here. And did you know that he attended Iolani, and Iolani was an English immersion school, just like Kamehameha, just like Punahou. It was English immersion. That was the term they used. He wrote an essay, and it was voted the best essay. And guess who gave him the award for the best essay? King Kalakaua. Wouldn't you think that would have a lot of impression, a good impression would be made on him? That's like going to America and the President of the United States is giving you an award. You know, he's like, wow, the King of Hawaii just gave me an award. Hawaii definitely affected Dr. Sun Yat-sen. So now, with this backdrop, let's take a look at what happened in 1893. Not from a historical standpoint, where I'm going to read Kaikendall and his interpretation. I'm not going to read Gavin Dawes and his interpretation. I'm not going to read someone else and their interpretation. Remember, the source that we need to look at is the president and the queen, because these are the two heads of states of two countries called the Hawaiian Kingdom and the United States of America. In March of 1893, President Cleveland initiated an investigation into the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani and her cabinet on January 17th. Now you notice the Queen and her cabinet. What happened in 1893 was the removal of the Queen, the executive monarch, and her cabinet, replacing them with insurgents, but keeping everybody in government. Everybody. the police, the teachers, the courts, all they're going to do is sign oaths of allegiance to this new regime while being protected by the U.S. military. And that signing of this petition of allegiance is the basis of the song that we know today as Kaulananapua, which was composed by Miss Prendergast back in 1893 for the Royal Hawaiian Band, whose members refused to sign that oath of allegiance. And they all got fired by this new regime, no job. She composed that song to reflect their resistance. And one of the lyrics in that song says, "Do not sign the paper of the enemy with its sin of annexation and loss of civil rights." Doesn't sound too cultural, yeah? Well, it's very political. But it's in Hawaiian. So if you don't speak Hawaiian, you don't understand what they're saying. But as we are now learning our language again, now we're listening to Kaulananapua, and it's being played in Safeway. Don't sign the paper of the enemy with its sin of annexation and loss of civil rights. But those who don't know Hawaiian, hey, they start tapping. Kaulananapua o Hawaii, kupa'ama. That's a heavy song. Heavy song. In fact, my auntie, Marlene Tsai. Anybody know Marlene Tsai, the entertainer? It's my dad's sister. In the 1960s, my papa was told by her that she's going to sing Kaulananapua, going to record it. My papa told her, you're not going to record it until you understand it. And my papa sat her down and went over the whole thing. My papa, his first language was Hawaiian, and he explained it. And that was the first time my Auntie Marlene knew actually what Kaulananapua was all about, other than, hey, it's a good melody. And that, I don't want to spill the beans yet, but we're going to get there. Because I don't want to say, I'm saying it. I want to show you who said it. And it's going to answer that question. Yeah. Good question, though. Okay. So, on December 18th, 1893, the president reported to the U.S. Congress his findings and conclusions of the investigation, called a message to Congress. Now, that message to Congress would also resonate to all diplomats in Washington, D.C., who are there with their embassies. That's why whenever you have the United States president speaking in front of Congress, you have ambassadors involved, just listening. Just like when you had Trump there. Who was in the audience? The Russian ambassador. You also had other diplomats listening, because what they say will affect international relations. So President Cleveland stated on the 16th day of January, 1893, this is from his message, between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a detachment of Marines from the United States steamer Boston with 2 pieces of artillery landed at Honolulu. So they're Marines, with some naval personnel. The men, upwards of 160 in all, were supplied with double cartridge belts filled with ammunition and with haversacks and canteens, and were accompanied by a hospital corps with stretchers and medical supplies. What do you think they're about to engage? Bang, bang. That's what they're preparing for. Now, what does Cleveland say with regard to the actions taken by U.S. military in Hawaii? This military demonstration upon the soil of Honolulu was of itself an act of war. Trigger word, because that's an invasion. Okay? And now the president is going to be speaking to the Queen and her position as the head of state. On the one hand, the Queen had possession of the palace, of the barracks, of the police station, and had at her command at least 500 fully armed men and several pieces of artillery. Indeed, the whole military force of her kingdom was on her side and at her disposal, while the Committee of Safety, the insurgents, by actual search had discovered that there were but few arms in Honolulu that were not in the service of the government. It kind of gives you an idea. They're not in control. But yet our history shows that these guys actually succeeded. This whole issue is about U.S. military, not about these insurgents. And then he concludes, in this state of things, if the Queen could have dealt with the insurgents alone, her course would have been plain and the result unmistakable. Now, two buzzwords that just came up here: act of war, insurgents. These are terms that are used during warfare. You don't talk about that during peace. Okay? And then he states, but the United States had allied itself with the kingdom's enemies, had recognized them as the true government of Hawaii, and had put her and her adherents in the position of opposition against lawful authority. She knew that she could not withstand the power of the United States, but she believed that she might safely trust to its justice. And this is when the Queen went to the second stage, surrender. I, Lili Okalani, by the grace of God and under the Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom. You notice it says under the Constitution. She's not above it. She's a constitutional monarch. Do hereby solemnly protest against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And all acts done against myself by certain persons claiming to have established a provisional government, a temporary government. That I yield to the superior force of the United States. You notice she's not referring to the insurgents, right? The United States, their troops. Whose ambassador, minister plenipotentiary, that's another word for ambassador, His Excellency John Stevens, has caused United States troops to be landed at Honolulu and declared that he would support the provisional government. Now, to avoid any collision of armed forces and perhaps the loss of life, she's referring to the U.S. military and Hawaiian authorities, not to the insurgents. If anything, the insurgents will get caught in the crossfire. I do this under protest and imperiled by said force, yield my authority until such time as the government of the United States shall upon the facts being presented to it, under the action of its representatives, and reinstate me in the authority as the constitutional sovereign. She is not giving up Hawaii. She's only yielding her authority until it can be investigated, the actions taken by the U.S. ambassador. And that's what Cleveland did. He investigated. Now, President Cleveland stated these insurgents. Who were they? What's their status? He said, when our minister recognized the provisional government, the only basis upon which it rested was the fact that they declared it to exist. They just said it. Yeah, we exist. That doesn't make it legal. But what it did was it made them into insurgents called treason. And if you are convicted for treason by a jury, you get hung. This is a capital crime. And that's what President Cleveland was dealing with. He said these guys were neither government de facto nor de jure. So again, legal terms that need to be understood. De facto, successful revolution. De jure, lawful government. They were neither. They're just insurgents, about 30 of them. Yeah? Imagine 30, 1.5 tables right here filled with you folks. How can you guys take over an entire country? With the U.S. military behind you, you can. That's what happened. And all they did was take over the head. It's called a hijacking. Remove the queen and her cabinet, called the pilot. Keep everybody in place. This is called Hawaiian Airlines. Yeah. Put U.S. Marines in front of the door to the pilot, protect them, and then release sleeping gas in the cabin. And then through time, paint that Hawaiian Airlines red, white, and blue. Over 124 years have passed. That paint is chipping off. People are starting to realize this is Hawaiian Airlines. The only thing that changed was the pilot, not the plane. So this is not about creating a new government. That infrastructure still exists today. That's how you take over an entire country. You don't overthrow a government, you take over the head with military protection. We call it in political science regime change. That's all that happened. Did you know the courts of today go back to 1845? All the circuits, 1845. The Board of Education, 1845. The police, the firemen, all from 1845. Nothing was created by the United States. All they did was take a real good system running and controlled it. That's all they did. And then convince everybody that it's not yours. It's ours. So the provisional government was created by the U.S. ambassador, and it served as a puppet. And President Cleveland admitted that. It's a puppet. Now here's the clincher. His conclusion when the U.S. Marines landed, because when they landed, that itself was an act of war. That's called invasion. Now, what was the consequence of that invasion? He stated, by an act of war, the government of a friendly and confiding people has been overthrown. By an act of war. Everything here is state of war. Period. This is not state of peace. International law requires a treaty of peace. We don't have a treaty. None. But yet we were led to believe something that's not true. Make sense? Now, this is all because of what Timoteo Ha'alilio, William Richards, and Sir George Simpson accomplished in getting Hawaii recognized as an independent state. Without what they did, I would not be talking about this. This would be frivolous, talking about state of war, talking about act of war. But the fact that they accomplished that in 1843 is why we are still a country. And that everyone here who didn't know you were still a country, that's the evidence of the crime. It's called denationalization, which I'll get into. So there's a reason why we don't know. Because I didn't know this before 1992. I was just like everybody else, out of sight, out of mind, right? So on January 17th, 1893, the Hawaiian Kingdom came under belligerent occupation. They overthrew the government. You admit you overthrew the government, you have to replace the actions of the government. That's what the law of occupation is. The law of occupation basically has two legal systems that exist at the same time: the occupier and the occupied. So when an invader comes in and overthrows the government, they are responsible and obligated to administer the laws of the occupied state. Remember independence, the laws? They just don't vanish. You overthrow the government, which is the apparatus to administer these laws, you got to replace that government temporarily. That's Article 43, Hague Convention, right? Regulating warfare. So the only thing that was overthrown in 1893, January 17th, was the government, not the country. That's important. If anything, what you folks will get out of today, if that's just all you get, you got it all. The rest are just technicalities. Now, according to Judge Crawford of the International Court of Justice, belligerent occupation does not affect the continuity of the state, even when there exists no government claiming to represent the occupied state. So even though the government was overthrown in 1893, which was admitted by the U.S. president, by an act of war that did not extinguish the Hawaiian Kingdom, it just admitted it took out its government apparatus. Just like in Iraq in 2003. When the Iraqi government, Saddam Hussein's government, was overthrown by the military, that did not mean Iraq ceased to exist. Iraq was still a state, and the law of occupation applied. So anybody, because a lot of local people were in the Guard who got deployed, they knew that they were administering Iraqi law during the occupation. They were not administering American law. And that's the Hague Convention, Article 43. So the Hawaiian state, when was the Hawaiian state recognized? What day? November 28th. You guys got to know November 28th. November 28th to Hawaiians is like 4th of July for Americans, right? That's how it's supposed to be. So you guys got to know November 28th. And then we had a government called the Hawaiian Kingdom, a constitutional monarchy that represented that state, that sovereignty, exercised that authority. That government was illegally overthrown, but the state still exists. That I did not know back in 1992. And that is when I came to that conclusion, I'm in the wrong army. The only change that happened since then was name changes. That's all, just name change. From the provisional government to the territory, to the republic, to the territory of Hawaii, to the state of Hawaii. That's the only thing that changed. Period. This entire governmental infrastructure that you have in Hawaii is from the Kingdom era. It is not American. It's just controlled by the Americans. So, stages of warfare. Now let's take a look at Hawaii. First stage, January 16th, 1893, state of war initiated. Why was a state of war initiated on January 16th? Who said what? Who initiated or concluded state of war? President Cleveland. Who? What did he say to initiate it? Act of war. The military demonstration on the soil of Honolulu was in of itself an act of war. That's heavy. Keep in mind, act of war, you don't drop that word anywhere. That is a trigger word, okay? Second stage, very next day, surrender, conditional surrender. Queen Liliʻuokalani, avoiding armed conflict with the armed forces, not with the insurgents. Marshal Charles Wilson and the police force could have easily taken the insurgents, just like President Cleveland admitted. They had 500 men armed. Marshal Charles Wilson, head of the police department, is about to take them. The only thing stopping Marshal Wilson and the 500 men was the U.S. Marines are going to have a conflict. Now the Queen was put in a position. This is not merely addressing insurgency. This is now dealing with an invading force. These are new rules they got to apply. Not new, other rules called international rules. Third, 1893, January 17, belligerent occupation started. But the United States did not administer Hawaiian Kingdom law because they were hiding the occupation. You know what was the driving force behind all of this in Hawaii? To secure Pearl Harbor as a military outpost. This whole thing was about Pearl Harbor. It was not about sugar. Pearl Harbor. We haven't gone to the fourth stage yet. No treaty. So now we go back to the NEA, National Education Association, and the Hawaii State Teachers Association. They're getting them to pass that proposal to document the illegal occupation. Can you understand now what it is in better context? That's what they're talking about, right? So we basically still have a state of war, just like Korea, whether we like it or not. Yeah. We are still in a state of war, and the laws of occupation apply, not our personal opinions. So let's distinguish between U.S. laws and Hawaiian laws. So this represents the United States, this represents Hawaii. 1898, United States passed a law annexing Hawaii. So 5 years in a state of war, Congress just passes a law taking Hawaii. You cannot annex a foreign state during war. A treaty of peace is when you have annexation. That's how it's supposed to work. Give you an example of a treaty of peace. 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was a treaty of peace terminating the Mexican-American War. In that treaty of peace, it provided for the transfer of all territory north of the Rio Grande, which we call today California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Utah. That was all Mexican territory. That was done by a treaty of peace. That was not done by a treaty of surrender. We don't have one. An annexation resolution is illegal in international law. And under American law, it has no effect anyway beyond its borders. Then 2 years later, they changed the name of the Hawaiian government to the territory of Hawaii. That is an American law called the Organic Act, passed by Congress. Then in 1959, they changed the name again to the state of Hawaii. Still limited to U.S. territory. That is the Statehood Act. And then in 1993, they apologized. Sorry. They actually passed a resolution apologizing. But that apology resolution is the source of a lot of confusion. For people who don't know terminology, they use the apology resolution as if it justifies something. They say self-determination. Native Hawaiians have not relinquished their right to self-determination. Before you say or regurgitate, hey, we didn't give up our right to self-determination, can anybody explain to me what is self-determination instead of just restating what the apology law said? Self-determination only applies to people who are not countries yet. That's self-determination. And in order to achieve or exercise self-determination, you go through what is called decolonization, to become your own country. So I hear a lot of sovereignty groups keep citing the apology resolution and the right to self-determination. All you're doing is reinforcing the very problem you're trying to get out of. Then it says Native Hawaiians are indigenous people of the United States. No, we're not part of the United States. And that thing just, it was like steroids being put in the sovereignty movement but also in OHA's federal recognition movement, because then you're going for tribal status. But it's all operating on the false premise. So can you understand why terms are important? That's like using baseball terms in a football game. It's like I'm explaining an off-tackle run using the pitcher and the catcher and a bunt. So you might say we've been using baseball rules to explain a football game. Now you know in my class, in my college, my graduate course, can you see why it's important to know your terminology first and stop BSing? And if you don't know, you don't know. Go look it up. And that's important. But there's a reason why we don't know, and I'll be getting into that. Now here is Hawaiian law, established by the Hawaiian legislative process in 1893. Hawaiian law does not apply in Orange County, California, and American law does not apply in Hilo, because you have international law that separates them, because both countries are independent. American law is independent over American territory. Hawaiian law is independent over Hawaiian territory. So what we have is international law. So international law is a law between the countries, right? International, not within the countries. And that's the Hague and Geneva Conventions, the laws of war, and the laws of occupation. Now, what does the United States Supreme Court say about American law? It says the laws of no nation can justly extend beyond its own territories. They can have no force to control the sovereignty of any other nation. So for people to use the apology resolution constantly, that contradicts that statement right there, because it's limited to U.S. territory. Now, you can use the apology resolution if you're in California, but not in Hawaii. Because the more you use the apology resolution, you're admitting American can pass a law that applies to Hawaii when it can't, because it's independent. You see the problem you're going to run into? That's why, again, it's important to know what Timoteo Ha'alileo, William Richards, and Sir George Simpson accomplished with Commandment the 3rd, Hawaiian independence, November 28th. That is the cornerstone of all of this stuff, not the rhetoric that comes out of me trying to explain something. And then another court case in 1936, it says, neither the Constitution nor the laws passed in pursuant of it have any force in foreign territory. Again, reiterating what they said in 1823. But it goes on to say, and operations of the nation in such territory must be governed by treaties, international understandings and compacts, and the principles of international law. We've been looking at Hawaii's history through American law. Well, you got to be a part of America to use that. Because Hawaii is not a part of the United States, you're supposed to use international law to interpret. And if you notice, that's what I was using to explain our history with the United States, was international law, which now makes sense as to why the Queen did what she did, why Marshall Wilson did what he did. Right? Remember, they weren't a part of the United States. That generation there, my great-grandfather, William Kuʻokoʻa Simerson, in Napo'opo'o, was 13 years old. He was born in 1880. He was 13 in 1893. He was not American. He was Hawaiian. And that term Hawaiian is a nationality. It's not ethnicity. Hawaiian is a short term for Hawaiian subject. Yeah? You can be Chinese and Haole and be Hawaiian. That's how it was. So Sanford Dole, Lauren Thurston, they weren't American. They were both Haole, but they were both Hawaiian subjects. That's important to know. Well, here's the reason why we don't know. And I would recommend, don't act like you folks do know. Because I never know either. You got to admit that first. Before you can learn something, you got to admit that what you know may not be what is correct. And I operate from the presumption that when you come to my class at UH, everything you think you know, out the window. Because I can chalk that up to brainwashing. Now let's get into what happened, and then we go revisit what you thought you knew. But there's a reason why we didn't know. Called brainwashing. 1906, Program for Patriotic Exercises in the Public Schools. Department of Public Instruction. This is DOE. It's going to be used across all schools, public and private. The theme of the program was to indoctrinate the children of Hawaii to be American and to speak English. Now we're talking my tutu's generation. Not my great-grandparents' generation, my tutu. My tutu was born in 1910. All she's going to learn is American. And if she speaks Hawaiian, she gets beaten. Those are the stories we hear. Now, Hawaiian is not an ethnic language. It's the national language. Hawaiian law was both in Hawaiian and English, right? But Hawaiian was the national language. It wasn't a bunch of natives sitting in the corner talking native like it appears today. It's almost like the natives speak, the non-natives cannot speak. Back then, even Sanford Dole was fluent in Hawaiian because he had to be, not because he was trying to be. Just like how you speak French in France, Russian in Russia, you speak Hawaiian in Hawaii. So what do? You take that language out. And that process is what we call denationalization in international law. Denationalization, that's an English international term. Denationalization is basically to obliterate the national consciousness of the people of an occupied state. Germany was prosecuted for war crimes after World War II for Germanization in occupied territories. So denationalization is a violation of Article 56 of the Hague Convention, where institutions of teaching and science cannot be touched. Now, if you go into the schools, the institution of learning, and now you start training the children to be American, that's the war crime. So everybody's ignorance today, you have an excuse. You're the evidence of the crime. Yeah. So even if you don't believe it, you're still the evidence. In fact, you're more evidence by you not believing it. Now, Harper's Weekly magazine from New York sent a reporter to Hawaii to do a story on this brainwashing. And they visited 3 public schools, Ka'iolani Public School, Ka'ahumanu Public School, and Honolulu High School, before the name was changed to President William McKinley High School. Okay? So this is in 1907. So 614 school children at Ka'iolani Public School, which still exists across from Tamashiro Market and Kaumakapili Church in Honolulu. 614 school children from grades 1 through 8, at the command of the principal, start marching. Then they line up in front of the American flag, and at the command of the principal, they salute. And that's how they salute, like that. It says here, at the command of the principal, they yell in unison, we give our heads and our hearts to God and our country. One country, one language, one flag. That's my Tutu's generation. This scene shows the salute to the American flag, which flies in the grounds of the Ka'iolani Public School, which has many Japanese. The drill is constantly held as a means of inculcating patriotism in the hearts of the children. Inculcate. That term means brainwashing through repetition. That's the definition of inculcate. That is mind-blowing, the way they're talking. That's like talking about an inferior people. That's like Germans talking about Jews during World War II. That's heavy. When I was in the army, we're supposed to fight countries that do that. Now I just realized it happened in my country. Pretty heavy, huh? See, that's when I went through the phase called OMG to WTF. So, here's a book that came out on the 100th anniversary, 1998, of so-called annexation. Was Hawaii annexed? Well, Tom Kaufman, he's a former Associated Press reporter and reporter, I think, for the Star Bulletin. Nation Within, the story of America's annexation of the nation of Hawaii. Is that correct? You can't annex a foreign state by passing a law, and you can't annex a foreign state during war. You can only have a treaty to annex anything. So in 2009, I believe, he came out with a revised edition. His book now is published by, what university is that? It's a big-time university publishing. God, escaped me. Just came out. Everything stayed the same, meaning the editors proofed it. They didn't have to change anything. Where's my cousin Koei? Shoot. Okay, well, I actually wrote a book review for the Hawaiian Journal of History on this. But he came out with revised edition in 2009, and then it was reprinted by this very highly respected publisher at some university. I'll get it. It'll come to me. But in 2009, he came up with the revised edition. Look at the subtitle now. Nation Within, the History of the American Occupation of Hawaii. And that's pretty heavy. Tom Kaufman is an American. Now, before Tom made that change, because I know Tom, he called me. And he says, Keanu, I'm coming out with the revised edition. I'm changing the cover, the name, the title on the cover. I said, oh, okay. And then he told me what the change was. I said, wow, Tom, that's awesome. He says, I just wanted to let you know because you had a hand in getting me to make the change. He read one of my law journal articles. And he also realized research was being done at the University of Hawaii that was speaking to these issues from a historical standpoint, not from a political standpoint, right? So he said, I just wanted to let you know. I said, right on, Tom. Now here he is explaining why he changed it. I am compelled to add that the continued relevance of this book reflects a far-reaching political, moral, and intellectual failure of the United States to recognize and deal with its takeover of Hawaii. In the book's subtitle, the word annexation has been replaced by the word occupation, referring to America's occupation of Hawaii. Where annexation connotes legality by mutual agreement, the act was not mutual and therefore not legal. There's no treaty. Since by definition of international law there was no annexation, we are then left with the word occupation. In making this change, I have embraced the logical conclusion of my research into the events of 1893 to 1898 in Honolulu and Washington. I am prompted to take this step by a growing body of historical work by a new generation of Native Hawaiian scholars. Dr. Keanu writes, the challenge for the fields of political science, history, and law is to distinguish between the rule of law and the politics of power. He concludes, in the history of Hawaii, the might of the United States does not make it right. Very succinctly stated, right? And that's a reality check. For us, what are we going to do about that? Well, just as he had to deal with the reality of it and make that change, he told me, and he honestly stated this to me, he said, it was hard for him to admit that because he's an American. That's what he told me. But he said he couldn't deny it. He had to come out, but he used our research that was being done at the university to kind of push him over. Like, come on, Tom, you can do it, you can do it. It's okay, because this is not anti-American, right? This is just saying, this is an America. And might doesn't make right. I'm there. You know, I used to be in the system where might makes right, but that's only in war, not in law. So, sign of the American occupation. So now with this backdrop and understanding of this history, you're going to see occupation symbols all over. And you folks may not even notice it. So all I'm doing is putting the highlighter on things based upon terminology. That's occupation right there. This flag here is not a state of the United States. That is the Hawaiian Kingdom. With that flag under the United States, that is occupation. That's what it is. Because you have two distinct national ensigns, not a flag of one of the states of the United States. So, how do you right the wrong? See, back in 1994 when I retired, I had to have had a plan to address this, right? And the one thing I had to learn very quickly was terminology, theoretical frameworks, context. I learned from the sovereignty movement, they didn't know what they were doing. They were making stuff up. They were calling the 1840 Constitution, Jehovah, this and that. Then you, from a Christian perspective, then you had those using 1887 Constitution. Well, that's treason, because even James Blunt said it was treason. That was the beginning of the takeover, the insurgency, you know. You had others saying the Mahele was bad, Howleys took over, missionaries created the Constitution. All of this was wrong, completely wrong. So terminologies are so important. Give you an example. There was one professor at the University of Hawaii, I was sitting in a meeting, who came out and said that the Howleys, the missionaries, forced Kamehameha III to have a constitution in order for them to own all the land in Hawaii through the Great Mahele. That's what she said. And her background is anthropology, not political science. So she doesn't have a law background to understand it. Now, right off the bat, when you say missionaries controlled Kamehameha III to have a constitutional system so they can own land, right there is nonsensical. It doesn't make sense. The reason why it doesn't make sense, when you put a constitutional system upon a leader, what you do is you decentralize their control. You create checks and balances. That's what a constitution means. That's why constitutions only come up either through revolution, against a tyrant, or you evolve to the point of constitutional development like in Great Britain. You don't have a revolution. So you wouldn't force Kamehameha III, if you want to own all the land in Hawaii, to have a constitutional system, because what that constitutional system would do is create agencies. You got to pay taxes. If you don't pay your taxes, you get your land taken away. All these things. So it doesn't make sense. If anything, if the missionary wanted to control all the land in Hawaii, or the majority of the land, you don't have the king establish a constitutional system. That's like me being a executive for Chevron oil, and I'm going to make a agreement with Saddam Hussein back in the 90s that I'm going to say, I can't drill oil to make all the money I can until you create a constitutional system, Mr. Hussein, so that there's checks and balances for me to follow and taxes to pay. What I would rather do was maintain Saddam Hussein in an absolute authority. I deal directly with him, and that's exactly what was happening. Does that make sense? But those kind of talks about constitutional systems, when people don't understand it, it sounds gibberish. But yet, they're teaching that at the university. People are saying that in the community. I'm like, what? What Kamehameha III did was actually do something that was unbelievable. It wasn't through a revolution. He did it voluntarily. That's amazing. Amazing. But nobody knows that. Everybody's getting caught up in other people's histories. That's why it's important to know Hawaii's history. So, from this concept, this framework, since 1893, there has been no lawful government in Hawaii. Can I conclude that? Using the law, not the opinions, law, right? So when that government was overthrown in 1893, that government wasn't restored, period. Because if it was restored, we wouldn't be in the position we're in right now. The occupation would have ended, but it didn't. Now, did you know that you cannot have elections during occupations? Yeah, you cannot. Here's the reason why. Does anybody know who is responsible for elections in government? Any government. Let's use California as an example. The governor of California, called the executive branch, basically registers voters. Yeah, they have an election office. So the governor does that, meaning you have to have a government there to do the elections. Now, if you're occupied, do you have a government there to run elections? Under the state of war, it's the occupier that administers the laws of the occupied state. You don't have elections until the occupation comes to an end. That's when it happens. And that's when the transfer of authority takes place. And then, to convene the legislative body. Who convenes the legislative body of these elected officials? The governor. So you need a government first to have an election. But how can you have an election during occupation? You see the catch-22. This is the terms now that need to be understood. This is what I was understanding. Just through my understanding of international relations through the lens of a military officer, which is limited, but enough to know what you can and cannot do. And in the laws of occupation, under FM 27-5, U.S. Army Field Manual 27-5, it says even the American government in the military says during occupations, elections are suspended because everything is controlled by a military governor. So they don't even allow elections during their occupations. So how then can we form a government that can begin to speak about the country called the Hawaiian Kingdom? Not as a sovereignty group, not as people signing up for anything, but the country that my great-grandfather was born in. That's the one I'm talking about. How do we bring that back out into the international arena? Well, we follow certain ideas from how governments were formed in exile during World War II. And they're called provisional governments. See, a provisional government is not a permanent government. That's why it's called provisional, acting, interim. Those are the terms that are applied to government. If you try to say you're the permanent government during occupation without lawful authority, that's treason. So you got to be careful how you use the word provisional. Remember the provisional government of 1893? Remember those guys? They were claiming that they were a provisional government by necessity. And their justification was the queen was a tyrant. We got to take control. See, that's necessity. That is the basis of how you form governments in exile, by necessity. Or you can form governments within the country called in situ, not in exile, in situ, which is what Sanford Dole and them did. But you know that justification, you better be right, because if you're not, that's treason. And what did President Cleveland do? He concluded they were insurgents. That means they weren't a real government. So you got to be careful when you're playing with this knife, this government knife. Make sure you don't grab the blade, you grab the handle. But I'm here thinking, got to do something. This is 1994 when I retired. My plan is to address this issue in the face of everybody not knowing anything. Imagine that. Nobody knew nothing. This was 1994, all right? And we had to come up with something. So in 1995, a legitimate provisional government was established to represent the Hawaiian state, not the people. Why is it that a provisional government cannot represent the people? Because they weren't elected. They weren't commissioned. You can't claim to represent the people, but provisional governments represent the state, which by virtue protects the people through the laws of that state. But the provisional governments never represent people. They represent the state. And the principle relied on was exactly what they did in 1893, necessity. The legal doctrine of necessity. It's actually a legal doctrine. And you actually use necessity in wartime, right? But it has to be proportionate, right? So this is the legal definition of necessity. An imperative necessity must arise of the existence of exceptional circumstances not provided for in the Constitution for immediate action to be taken or to preserve some vital function of the state. Notice they're referring to the state, not the people. And this is from the British common law. There's actually a court case in the 1990s that addressed this. It actually was used in the trial of Spite, who was an insurgent in Fiji. 1990s, took over the prime minister who was of Indian descent, and there was a takeover. He was claiming necessity. He was put on trial. His defense was necessity. They found you broke every threshold here, every benchmark. He got convicted of treason. He's in jail right now. All these things is what we were looking at before we do something. You just don't create it and then start looking, did I do it right? You got to make sure, can it be done? And is there precedence on it? Because that's what's going to have to speak to what we do, not me trying to sell it. I got to rely on some legal principles. The second benchmark, there must be no other course of action reasonably available. Actions taken must be necessary in the interest of peace, order, and good government. It must not impair the just rights of citizens under the Constitution. And it must not have the intention of consolidating power. You're there just holding the fort. It's no different than a private in the army becomes a lieutenant in time of war. Everyone taken out, you still have the chain of command, but it's up to that private to assume the chain of command in order to maintain the command structure. He's called the acting lieutenant. And then when the properly commissioned officer comes, he goes back down being a private. We used to do it all the time. We also had this done in government. So in the case of Spite and his trial regarding the Fijian insurrection, Spite did not meet these benchmarks because he was consolidating power as if he was the government. He started to act like he was the government. And they disregarded rights of citizens under the Constitution, which also included Indians by ethnicity. Did you know a lot of Indians live in Fiji? They were sent there by British to work on the plantations when Fiji was a colony. Those Indians are now Fijian. Fijian by nationality, not ethnicity. Because Fijian goes to Fiji, that's an island name, not to the native name. Well, Spite and them were basically saying Fijians of Indian descent do not have any rights. So every point was hit, and it was not to the benefit of Spite. So he was convicted. So these are the things that I got to think about when we're about to walk down this path. I got to make sure that there is some roadmap on how to walk it. And I got to look at others who did walk it, but also learn from those who did it wrong. Right? Now, U.S. constitutional scholar Thomas Cooley, 1893, he's referring to the provisional government of Hawaii. He actually says this is the definition of a provisional government, which these guys aren't acting as. So he's confirming that they're not a real provisional government. So according to Thomas Cooley, he says a provisional government is supposed to be a government de facto, in fact, for the time being. A government that in some emergency is set up to preserve order, to continue the relations of people it acts for with foreign nations until there shall be a time and opportunity for the creation of a permanent government. It is not in general supposed to have authority beyond that of a mere temporary nature resulting from some great necessity, and its authority is limited to the necessity. So we're looking at not only what they understood in 1893 as far as what is a provisional government, but also as close to as 1990s. And it's all consistent legally. So, state still exists. Hawaiian Kingdom government overthrown. What was formed was a provisional government in 1995, also referred to as an acting government, pro temp. All those terms are temporary. The purpose of the provisional government as officers de facto, in fact, not by election, not by commission, is first to expose the prolonged and illegal occupation of the Hawaiian Kingdom by the United States. Just expose, talk. Second, to ensure that the United States complies with the laws of occupation, which includes the Hague and Geneva Conventions. That's all, compliance. And third, to provide for an effective transition for governance under Hawaiian law when the occupation comes to an end. That's all it does, and this is in line with the law of occupation. Because it is not the provisional government of an occupied state to administer Hawaiian Kingdom law. That is the duty and obligation of the occupier to do that. That's called Article 43 of the Hague Convention. You don't compete with them to administer laws because you don't have effectiveness. So what if I say, oh, I'm gonna carry out Hawaiian law, and if you don't follow, I'm gonna arrest you? How can I even do that? I'm just talking, right? You're still gonna do what you're gonna do. Now the occupier who's in control, guess what? They're gonna put you away because what you may do could be a war crime that they could be held liable for. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna expose all of that. That's all I did was just talk. And boy, by this talking, I ruffled the feathers of a lot of people. Back in 1995, oh, perfect title. I said, titles don't exist in Hawaii. 1893, who's the notary? Notaries weren't there. These are insurgents. So land titles could not be transferred after 1893. What happened to us in 1997? We get arrested for racketeering, money laundering, tax evasion, and theft. See, now you're hitting the core of the problem. Now they're looking at this as a threat. I didn't tell anybody to do anything. I'm just bringing it out. Oh, racketeering, tax evasion, theft. I think just theft. I thought it was money laundering. How's that? Coming after me for that. You know what? As a retired officer, I am the most conservative guy you're going to meet here. I'm not an activist. Far from it. I just follow the rules. And because I'm following rules that you don't like, now you're attacking me? See, now I know it's real. Because you wouldn't attack me if I wasn't a threat. I didn't even hurt anybody. But everybody else got hurt by the state of Hawaii, and they try to blame me. Like, hey, I'm just bringing out the truth. I'm sorry, this is an apple. It's not an orange. That's all I'm saying. But that's what created the problem. But then again, that is a consequence of exposure. Exposure, yes. Okay, so the Hague and Geneva Conventions. So, first of all, sources of international law. Let's start off with sources of international law. First source is customary international law. Okay, customary international law means every country, not majority. Okay? Every country accepts it to be law. That's called customary international, like diplomatic immunity. Every country accepts that. You don't have to have it into a treaty, right? Now, you then have the second source of international law called treaties. Treaties are agreements between countries. Now, treaties can create new law based upon what's in the treaty, right? But it's only binding on the countries that signed it. But you can also have a treaty that is multilateral. More than one country signs off on it. And they could actually codify international law, codify customary international law. So in 1893, what was the law of occupation at that time and the laws of war? That's the first step to know what is customary international law at that time. It goes back to the Brussels Convention, the Brussels Conference of 1881. That is when they began to attempt to codify customary international law for warfare. Because you had issues of pillaging. You had unwanted destruction not based upon necessity. So they needed to begin to codify customary international law. They finally were able to codify it in 1899 Hague Convention. 1899 Hague Convention was then superseded by the 1907 Hague Convention. And every scholar, every court, they all say that the 1899 and the 1907 Hague Convention is merely codification of customary international law. That's important, because that's a good point you brought up, because it's after 1893. But remember, international law, you got to know how it works. Customary international law can be codified. Even the 1949 Geneva Convention is codification of customary international law. Because the Geneva Conventions, after World War II, was not addressing the laws of war between countries, which the Hague Convention does, but it was actually addressing the effects of war and occupation on civilians and prisoners of war. That's the Geneva Conventions. But both are codification of customary international law. So let me give you an example of how it works. World War I was from 1914 to 1918, 4 years. In 1919, the year after, the Allied forces came together and formed what is called acknowledging what war crimes are. So they stated pillaging is a war crime. Denationalization of nationals of an occupied state, war crimes. Mass murder, war crime. That's 1919. That's the first time you hear war crimes. First time. You don't hear it before 1919. Because only countries can be held accountable, not people. People were just carrying out orders of their commanders. After World War I, they're going after the Kaiser of Germany for starting World War I. They wanted to prosecute the Kaiser as an individual, not as a country. So they began prosecuting certain individuals, not the Kaiser, he was protected after a while, but certain individuals were prosecuted for war crimes of denationalization. In Bulgaria, well, regarding Bulgarians and Germans. Now, how is it that they could prosecute people for war crimes of alleged crimes from 1914 to 1918 when the war crime of denationalization took place in 1919, 1 year after, right? But they still did it because in the Hague Convention, in its preamble, in 1907 and 1899, there is what is called the Martens Clause. The Martens Clause says whatever is not codified in these conventions is still recognized as customary international law. So their position in 1919 was denationalization was a war crime before they created the term denationalization. That's how they could prosecute after the fact. So that's an example of after, but you have to make sure that you are codifying customary international law. You're not creating new law. Because if you're creating a new law, you can only prosecute people under that law from that point on, not past. It's called an ex post facto law. You cannot have a law that has retroactive effect unless it's customary. So that is important to know because in 1893, all the war crimes that they were talking about during World War I also applied to Hawaii. Make sense? That's a good question though. Because a lot of people think, oh, but it came after. Hey, bro, come on. This is how international law works. And the example of World War I is a prime example. What is that? Oh, exactly. Yeah. Because these ideas of war crimes actually could have started customary-wise from 1881. Yeah, that's what they always refer to the Brussels Brussels Conference, yeah. If you guys go to hawaiiankingdom.org/blog, take a look at that, Martin's Clause. Just Google. I mean, put in a search engine. So all of this is going to be tested, right? Because right now it's a story. I'm weaving a story to you guys. And Hawaiians are good storytellers. And you don't know if I'm telling you the truth, but hey, it sounds good, you know? It's going to be tested from outside, not from me trying to argue with you, I'm right. It's got to be tested. So remember when Hawaii is going to be the provisional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom, also called the acting government, provisional government, government interim. We got to be careful. I was always careful to use those terms because I'm not going to commit treason. I got to be careful. Even though you folks may not even understand why I'm even using it. Because your folks' understanding is irrelevant to my actions. Because when you folks wake up to this reality of the law, you might become a prosecutor in the Hawaiian Kingdom and come after me for treason. You could. There's no statute of limitation on this. That's why I got to be very careful how I walk this. And a lot of times you got to walk slow. You don't run, right? It's called crawl, walk, run. A lot of times we're still crawling until we feel comfortable, then we start standing up, then we start walking. But it's going to come to a test. So when we're going out and exposing Hawaii's occupation, a lot of people thought we're part of the sovereignty movement. Oh yeah, they thought I was one of the government. No, I'm not chasing sovereignty. I'm exposing it. And I'm addressing denationalization that has happened since 1906. I'm dealing with people who don't know nothing. I'm not even assuming you know something. So when I go out, I just talk. And back then, I didn't have a PowerPoint like how I have now. Back then, I had a overhead projector with transparencies. How was that? That's the old days. That's like the cell phone with the, looks like a big brick. So I used to put transparencies on. In fact, Namako Ka'aina filmed me giving a talk on Hawaiian Kingdom law, 4.5 hours at the Hilo Queen Lili Okalani Children's Center. So they have you can order it online from Namako Ka'aina. So Joan and Puhipao were filming me giving this talk. Overhead projector, transparencies, copies of original documents, yeah, and I'm giving a talk. One of my friends, I sit on his doctoral committee now, but he took my class, and he's now a PhD student. He called me one time and says, "Hey, Keanu," at Sinclair Library, which is in UH Manoa. He goes, he was going through the catalog online, and he noticed there's a video, 4.5 hour video of Keanu Sai and Hawaiian Kingdom law. So he had to go get it. You know, so he watched it. It's on DVD now. Then he calls me after, he says, "Bro, you know what's amazing? You're saying the same thing. It's just you didn't have a PhD back then, and you didn't have PowerPoint." I said, well, that's good, right? I'm saying the same thing, but now I have a PhD, and now I got PowerPoint. But now I sit on his doctoral committee. And he's doing his research on land titles. And I think Donovan is going to be here tomorrow. Yeah, he's going to talk about land titles. Yeah. Yes, sir. Keanu. Yes. Well, let me get to the end because we're going to tie it all up and then we're going to open up for questions. See, because Cully went into my time, so I'm still good. Oh, there's Donovan. Okay. Okay, so when we were going around exposing Hawaii's occupation, I gave a talk at Shipman Industrial Area, I think. And there was a guy in the audience, and I'm giving a presentation. I'm saying, you got to follow Hawaiian Kingdom law, this and that, blah, blah, blah. His name was Lance Larson. I didn't know. He was just like anybody else in the audience. Well, this guy, Lance Larson, took it to be true what I was saying. And when he went home, he looked into whether or not the Hawaiian Kingdom had any law on driver's license. Right? Because driver's license is an American law, Hawaii Vice statute, which was created by the state of Hawaii, which was created by the U.S. Congress, which is limited to the United States. So we realized there's no law on driver's license because there were no automobiles in 1893. So what he does on his own is takes off his license plate, puts a big placard on the back of his truck, his Jeep Comanche, and he starts driving around Hilo, and on the placard it says, "The laws are obligatory upon all persons, whether subjects of this kingdom or citizens or subjects of any foreign state, while within the limits of this kingdom." That is Section 6 of the Hawaiian Civil Code. And driving around, and he was collecting a lot of tickets. A lot of tickets. My friend, Officer Leland Powell, was the one giving him all the tickets. He went to court at Keʻokoʻa District Court, which is where the old one, yeah, by Foodland, okay? And Ninia Parks, she's the attorney for Lance. She represents Lance and basically says because there's no treaty, Lance has to follow Hawaiian Kingdom law. Otherwise, he'll be committing treason. Well, Sandra Schutte didn't like that argument, and I even served as an expert witness in that case. I was admitted as an expert witness by Sandra Schutte, the judge. I explained there's no treaty. Doesn't exist. So her conclusion, her decision was against Lance. He's going to be fined like $700, $900, whatever it was. And then she asked him, are you going to pay this? He said, no. You didn't show me the treaty. He says, if I pay this, I'm committing high treason against the Hawaiian Kingdom. And that's when she ordered him to be locked up 30 days, 7 days solitary confinement. Now that's another threat you hit. Yeah, if it was frivolous, but to put him in 7 days solitary confinement, whoa. So his attorney was quite concerned about Lance, because I'm there watching this whole thing, because I was the expert witness. And then she turns to me, because now she's going to shift. She's looking at me not as a person who knows Hawaii's legal history, so I could serve as an expert witness. She's now looking at me as an official of the provisional government. And she's saying, you're supposed to protect my client, because I don't know if he's going to get beaten in the prison, because that's what she was afraid of. If he's going into solitary confinement, things can happen. That was her concern. So she ended up coming after us in federal court in Washington, D.C., trying to seek habeas corpus to get her client out of prison. And then I told her, I said, this court in Honolulu, this federal court, is just as illegal as the Keʻokoʻa District Court. They're both American. We need to go to an international court, the Permanent Court of Arbitration. I said, they take cases or disputes between a state and a private party. Let's go that route. So we signed the arbitration agreement, binding agreement, and Judge Samuel King, who was the federal judge at that time, signed off on the arbitration to go to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and it leapfrogged from Honolulu to The Hague. This is the Permanent Court of Arbitration. It was established in 1899. Remember I talked about that first Hague Convention, Hague Conference, with Japan involved. That Hague Conference was to codify laws of war, codify, not create. The first thing they wanted to do was to establish what is called the Hague Convention for the peaceful settlement of international disputes, called the Permanent Court of Arbitration. They wanted countries to address resolution through arbitration before you go to war. And if you cannot resolve your dispute through arbitration, then you use the Hague Convention number 2 and 3 to regulate the war. But everybody was pushing, that's where you fix the problem. So this state of war that I'm speaking of, it's coming full circle. Now we're going back to the entity that was created because of state of war, or the possibility of going to a state of war. So it's formed by treaty in 1899. It provides arbitration services. So the Permanent Court of Arbitration is an intergovernmental organization. They're not a standing court with judges. Their job is to receive disputes, right? And then form a tribunal, arbitrators, to resolve that dispute. And the difference between arbitration and litigation. Arbitration is where the tribunal is made up of experts in the dispute. So if you are a plumber and you have a problem, arbitral dispute with another plumber, you put expert plumbers as the arbitrators because they understand. So the judge is also the expert. In litigation, the judges are not the expert. That's why you bring in expert witnesses, right? So tribunals are pretty much preferred under international law by countries because you bring in experts in certain areas. So if it's a boundary dispute, you bring in experts on boundaries. If it's a law of occupation dispute or occupation, bring in experts in occupational law. Excuse me. So the Permanent Court of Arbitration has institutional jurisdiction. It can only form tribunals if a state is involved. a state. So they can form a tribunal between two states. Oh, perfect. They can form a tribunal between two or more states. In this case, the Permanent Court of Arbitration Case Repository, Republic of Ecuador versus the United States. This was back in 2011. So the United States goes to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And if you notice, they identified Ecuador as a state, United States as a state. So that's an interstate arbitration. They can also establish tribunals for a state and an international organization. And this one is between Peru and the United Nations. They identify Peru as a state and the UN as an international organization. Then here comes Larson, Hawaiian Kingdom. A state and a private entity. A dispute between Lance Paul Larson and the Hawaiian Kingdom, whereby Lance Larson, a Hawaiian subject, alleges that the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom is in continual violation of international law by allowing American laws to be imposed in Hawaii. Now you notice, at the Permanent Court of Arbitration Case Repository, they're referring to a government. That's us. If we weren't the government, we wouldn't be there, because they would know it would be self-declared. And they also have to verify, separate from the government that's representing the Hawaiian Kingdom has to be a state. So they identified Lance Larson as a private entity, the Hawaiian Kingdom as a state. Now that is profound. That went on from 1999 to 2001, but none of you folks even know this stuff. Either people refuses to understand it, or just they're ignorant. But I'm still teaching this stuff, and this is proof positive that we were there. So once they verify the Hawaiian Kingdom to exist, and we are the government, provisional government, not permanent government, they formed the arbitrators, the tribunal. Two of these arbitrators are now serving as judges on the International Court of Justice. So that gives you an idea of the caliber of the tribunal, not just a bunch of ragtag individuals maybe having something against the United States. This is at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And there's Nenia Parks, who represented Lance Larson, and that's me as agent for the Hawaiian Kingdom. So I was actually there. I actually know the background of this case very intimately. Yeah. And this is from the American Journal of International Law. Another reputable institution, right? Not a ragtag group. They refer to the decision that was made by the court. It said at the center of the Permanent Court of Arbitration proceeding was that the Hawaiian Kingdom continues to exist and that the Hawaiian Consular Regency, representing the Hawaiian Kingdom, is legally responsible under international law for the protection of Hawaiian claimants, including the claimant, Lance Larson. In other words, the Hawaiian Kingdom was legally obligated to protect Larson from the United States' unlawful imposition of municipal laws through the political subdivision, the state of Hawaii. Now, I had nothing to do with writing this. This is from the American Journal of International Law on referring to court cases at the international level. As a result of this responsibility, Larson submitted that the Hawaiian Consular Regency should be liable for any international law violations that the United States had committed against him. Now, the word regency is not monarchy, okay? You guys can look it up. Regent is one who serves in the absence of a monarch. That's regency, yeah? It's not a monarchy. So we have to use all the rules and all the principles of Hawaiian law to do what we had to do in order for the Permanent Court of Arbitration to have actually accepted it. Like, oh yeah, everything, dot the I, cross the T's. So that's me over there at the Permanent Court of Arbitration with the beard. When I got home, my wife said, hey, shave that off. I said, hey, gotta look distinguished, you know. Try to take the focus away from here, bring them over here. So we were there, and the hearings was in December of 2000. And this is what they determined in the arbitration award. The one thing that, first of all, what Lance Larson had to overcome was what is called the indispensable third-party rule. Indispensable third-party rule. What that means is that because this is an international court, they do not have the power of subpoena. They cannot issue an order requiring the United States to show up, right? They have to participate on their own. And if they don't participate, and it goes to the heart of a decision to be made, the court cannot move forward. And that's called the indispensable third-party rule. Now, much confusion was brought up when I came home on that indispensable third-party rule. And I would try to explain to people what it means, and they try to tell me, no, that's not what it means. This is what it means. And I'm going, what? He's like my cousin who's trying to explain to me something. Brother, where you in school? What do you know about international law? No, I know because I read. What did you read? Brother, you can read. That doesn't mean you comprehend. So I'm trying to explain. I was like, okay, you know what, Paul already. He obviously thinks he knows what he's talking about. So I said, okay, it doesn't matter as long as I understood what went on, because this is going to lead to further actions to be taken. But I tried to explain. And I said, just go get my PhD and my master's and let me write articles on this so you can read it. Then I can tell my cousin, brother, you like learn, take my class. See, then I can grade you. I'm going to test your comprehension, test your reading comprehension. But the one thing that Lance Larson had to deal with, he wanted the tribunal to make a decision that the United States violated his rights in the unfair trial and when he was incarcerated. That's the first stage. Then, after the tribunal determines the U.S. violated his rights, then the second question is whether or not the acting government is liable for those violations and whether they have to pay reparations. So in order for the United States, in order for Lance Larson to move ahead against the acting government, he needed the participation of the United States, otherwise he couldn't get to us, right? And that's called the indispensable third-party rule. Does that make sense? Okay, so two cases that provided precedents for indispensable third parties, Monetary Gold and East Timor. One in the 1950s, one in the 1990s. Monetary Gold, 1950s, the indispensable third party was Albania. This was a case, Italy versus Great Britain, France, and United States. Albania refused to participate. Italy could not go after the three countries. Second precedent was East Timor. Indispensable third party was Indonesia. This was Portugal versus Australia. Indispensable third party, Indonesia, who refused to participate. Portugal could not go against Australia. So those were the two cases. So here's how they explain it. And this is from the award, the judgment. It follows that the tribunal cannot determine whether the respondent, the Hawaiian Kingdom, has failed to discharge its obligations toward the claimant, Lance Larson, without ruling on the legality of the acts of the United States. Yet that is precisely what the monetary gold principle precludes the tribunal from doing. As the International Court explained in the East Timor case, the court could not rule on the lawfulness of the conduct of a state, called the Hawaiian Kingdom, when its judgment would imply an evaluation of the lawfulness of the conduct of another state, which is not a party to the case. So they spoke exactly to what I just explained. So Lance Larson, before he could sue us, he needs the United States to participate. This was not about whether or not the Hawaiian Kingdom exists. The Hawaiian Kingdom exists because we're in the proceedings. Remember, they already verified the Hawaiian Kingdom is a state. This is a procedural issue. But what they did leave open was fact-finding. Fact-finding, you can get around the indispensable third-party rule. Because fact-finding serves as a grand jury, similar to a grand jury. Look at the facts and assign criminal responsibility for prosecution by another court. So it says at one stage of the proceeding, the question was raised whether some of the issues which the parties wish to present might not be dealt with by way of fact-finding. In addition to its role as a facilitator of international arbitration, the Permanent Court of Arbitration has various procedures for fact-finding, both between states and otherwise, a state and a private entity. Now, we didn't move forward on the fact-finding at that time. What we had to move forward with was re-education. This was December of 2000. The case ended February 2001. We needed to begin re-education, and that's when it was decided that the provisional government is going to have me enter the University of Hawaii, get my master's degree in political science and my PhD, and address the misinformation that is being taught. And that was my job. That's what I needed to do. Now, as this information is growing, HSTA is coming out with this, right? National Education Association is. People are learning it. People are teaching it. It's becoming common knowledge. This past summer, the South China Sea case came up, and that prompted us to move to fact-finding. So this is a case from the case repository between the Philippines and China. This is the case of China building islands in the South China Sea, turning it into military bases, right? One of those islands they were building was within the jurisdiction, the territorial jurisdiction of Philippines. So the Philippines filed a complaint against China for binding arbitration. And they identified the Philippines as a state, China as a state, just like how they identified the Hawaiian Kingdom as a state. So you notice, I want to stress here, I'm not trying to prove to you that the kingdom exists. It exists. The question is, we're now dealing with occupation. We're dealing with violations of rights. Now, in this proceedings, the indispensable third party came up. And they said that will the tribunal violate the principle of indispensable third party because their decision might require an evaluation of conduct of a state who's not participating. And the states that they were looking at were the countries that were surrounding the South China Sea: Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei. Philippines and China are just one of other countries of the South China Sea. So their decision was whether or not their decision might violate the indispensable third party rule. And they determined that it didn't. And there was a hearing on it. And this is from the Arbitration Award, paragraph 181. The present situation is different from the few cases in which an international court or tribunal has declined to proceed due to the absence of an indispensable third party, namely Monetary Gold and East Timor, before the International Court of Justice, and Larson versus Hawaiian Kingdom. They've just identified Larson versus Hawaiian Kingdom as now the third precedent case on indispensable third party. If this was frivolous, you would not be citing it as one of the indispensable third parties. This is the legitimacy of the case itself, right? In all of those cases, the rights of third states, respectively Albania, Indonesia, and the United States, would not only have been affected by a decision in the case, but would have formed the very subject matter of that decision. Additionally, in those cases, the lawfulness of activities by a third state was in question. Here, none of the Philippines' claims entail allegations of unlawful conduct by Vietnam or other third states. In the case of Larson versus Hawaiian Kingdom, Nina Parks could not get around the fact that the U.S. was not involved because she's asking the tribunal to make a decision that the conduct of the United States in the trial of Lance Larson and his incarceration violated his rights. You can't come to that decision without having them there to defend themselves. And if they're not going to participate, then that means the case can't move forward. So that's pretty important. Larson versus Hawaiian Kingdom last year has now become a precedent case. That's pretty cool. So that gave us the opportunity to now go to fact-finding. Yes? We're going to get there. We're going to get there. So at this stage, the Fact-Finding Commission of Inquiry is only looking at Lance Larson's case. It's not looking at anybody here. It's his violations. The judge, the sheriffs, the deputy sheriff, they're looking at those individuals, whether or not they're liable for prosecution of war crimes. That's what the issue is. So fact-finding is going to determine whether or not these individuals are liable. Because Lance Larson is still a victim. Right? Even though people may have forgotten about him, he's still a victim. And I refuse to make him into a political person by standing here and I'm pointing to him. He's the victim. And he's the one that got hurt. And he's the one holding the Hawaiian government accountable for not protecting him. So I got to look at it very carefully. So the question then will be, with this information on fact-finding, who's liable to for prosecution of Lance Larson? We're not getting into whether or not Hawaii exists as a country. We're now getting into liability. That's why you got to be very careful at this stage on what you say. So, we're going fact-finding. Commissions of inquiry under the auspices of the permanent court serve in a similar capacity as grand juries. Commissions of inquiry not only review sets of facts, but also assign responsibility to those facts. To date, there have only been 5 commissions of inquiry since 1899. 5. The first commission was established in 1905 between Great Britain and Russia. The last one was in 1962 between Great Britain and Denmark. We're going to be the sixth one. Yeah. So, international commissions of inquiry will be comprised of 3 commissioners appointed in accordance with the Hague Convention. Number 3, which form the court. There's section 3 on how you form a commission of inquiry. The commission will determine first what is the function and role of the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom in accordance with laws of occupation and war, humanitarian law. What is our role? Because how can somebody be so quick to say we're liable for something? Well, how do we operate in a situation where everybody's brainwashed, everybody believes a lie, and nobody's listening to the truth? Because that's exactly what led to Lance Larson's problem. If anybody followed the rules, understood the history, Lance Larson wouldn't have had his problems, period. So what do you do in that light? What do you do when a representative of the provisional government gets arrested for racketeering, money laundering, tax evasion, and theft? What do you do? What do you do when provisional government, like my name, is being smeared all over? Yeah, telling people I rip off people, this and that. What do we do? I didn't rip off anybody. But boy, everybody loves to talk about it. They keep spreading that propaganda. Kind of reminds me of 1893 and what they were saying about Hawaiian subjects back then. But the thing is, we're getting Hawaiians saying that about me. It's like, oh, Hawaiian, take it easy. You know, when I first started in 1990s, when I first started, this information, people would, they would come up to me. People would come up to me and say, hey, you Keanu, sorry, I gotta go. Yeah, was that good or bad? And now, people go, hey, you Dr. Saya? Hey, right on, I think that's good, huh? But I'm saying the same thing. Same thing. I just got alphabets at the end of my name. So second, this is what they're going to address. Second, the commission will address what are the duties and obligations of the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom toward Lance Larson. What do we do about his violations? And by extension, toward all Hawaiian subjects residing in Hawaii and abroad. What are we supposed to do? And then third, what are the duties and obligations of the Hawaiian government toward protected persons who are in Hawaii? Protected persons is an international term for non-U.S. citizens in an occupied state. They're protected by the Geneva Convention. What do you do about them? When their own government don't even know Hawaii is occupied. So basically, this is a forum to basically expose this whole thing. Because we can't even get into this unless you understand and know Hawaii is occupied. War crimes have been committed. We're not talking about a sovereignty movement. We're talking about consequences. So the rules of the proceedings, basically Article 23 of the Hague Convention, the parties undertake to supply the Commission of Inquiry as fully as they may think possible with all means and facilities necessary to enable it to become completely acquainted with and to accurately understand the facts in question. That's the platform to lay everything out. And then they undertake to make use of the means at their disposal under their municipal law to ensure appearance of the witnesses or experts who are in their territory and have been summoned by the commission. See, now summoning can take place, subpoena. Because what you're subpoenaing or what you're summoning is not a country, private individuals, like any other court, right? So, part of my legal team, Professor Lanzarini, he's a professor at the University of Siena in Italy. He's a professor of international law. And Ben Emerson, a Queen's Counsel from Matrix Chambers in London. So that's my legal team. So we're supposed to be having the first hearings on January 16th and 17th. And I got to tell you, I always knew, and I got to be honest, I always kept thinking, how will the United States obstruct these proceedings? I mean, they're not just going to sit there and let it happen, right? When the Permanent Court of Arbitration case happened, we actually had to travel to Washington, D.C. at the request of the Secretary General back in, February of 2000, to travel to Washington to meet with the U.S. State Department to see if they want to join in the arbitration, meaning prove Hawaii is a 50th state. They couldn't. All they asked permission was, can we have access to all the records, meaning they acknowledge we're the government. Lance Larson's a war criminal, a war crime victim. and just ask permission. If there was any time that the United States could stop these proceedings, would have been then in 2000. But they would have to show the Hawaiian Kingdom doesn't exist as a state. They got to show it's the 50th state in order to stop these proceedings. They couldn't, because the facts are there, right? They can't. So after all of this, after the education has taken place for the last 17 years, law journal articles, doctoral thesis, master's thesis, it's boxing them in. They cannot overtly do anything. So what are they going to do? Still, they got to do something, right? Wouldn't you try to do something? This is headquarters for Pacific Command. You got 118 military installations here. You're just not going to sit down there and let this whole thing happen. So I'm watching this thing play out. I'm like, okay, commissioners appointed, 2 from London, 1 from Belgium. It's moving. And then, boom, Secretary General of the Permanent Court of Arbitration basically obstructing the proceedings. Yeah. A letter is sent to me. He says that the Permanent Court of Arbitration cannot proceed because entities that are not members of the United Nations cannot use this court. I'm looking at this like, wait a minute, what do you mean members of the United Nations? We were already there, right? It's not like we're trying to get back in. This case is stemming from the original case. And the tribunal, 2 of them are judges on International Court of Justice, made the recommendation to go to the permanent court to use fact-finding. So I'm like, what is this? So I had Professor Lenzerini from Italy try to contact the Secretary General. Secretary General refuses to meet with him. Now this is high level now. This is a professor of international law from Italy. He just sends him a letter, referring to the letter he sent to me, that you have to be a member of the United Nations before they can proceed. Then we had somebody else, the appointing authority, back in March, Professor Francesco Francioni from Italy, who's also an arbitrator in a case at the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and he sits as a judge on the Law of the Sea Tribunal. He sends the Secretary General a letter inquiring into this issue, and he can't even meet with the Secretary General, and he receives a letter making reference to Federico's letter, Professor Lenzerini, which makes reference to my letter. Something's happening. Number one, that's very evasive. See, when I was there, I used to talk to the Secretary General over the phone. In fact, he was the one that recommended I travel to Washington. This guy just doesn't want to talk. I'm sitting there going, there's something wrong with this. This has to prompt me to go, I got to go to The Hague. So I just got back from the Netherlands about 3 weeks ago. I was up there for a week in meetings. Before I went up, I had to find out where is this guy coming from with this. Because he said recent pronouncements by member states of the Permanent Court of Arbitration regarding membership to the UN. Recent pronouncements. So one thing, it says recent, but he doesn't give a date of how recent it was. Then he says member states of the Permanent Court, meaning countries that ratified the treaty, and they maintain the court. He doesn't say who or how many. He said recent pronouncements of member states of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. I'm like, so I spoke to a legal counsel from the Matrix Chambers in London. I said, hey, take a look at this letter. Can you tell me what your take on this is? Because it's very cryptic. And legal counsel from Matrix, who deals with international proceedings, said, I don't know what he's saying. I said, yeah, me either. And he said maybe he's referring to Kosovo. Going, Kosovo? Okay, so Kosovo broke away from Serbia in the 1990s as a result of the Yugoslavian state breaking up, okay? So Kosovo broke away, became an independent state. Serbia doesn't recognize their independence, but the United Nations does. But Kosovo is a state, not a member of the United Nations. So that's an entity, not a member of the United Nations. So I look it up, Kosovo, and the Permanent Court of Arbitration and recent pronouncements, I found out that it wasn't that. It wasn't Kosovo. I found out it happened in March of 2016, March of last year. There was a meeting at the Permanent Court of Arbitration amongst the countries that ratified the treaty. Because the countries who ratify the treaty become members of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. They fund it. The UN didn't create the Permanent Court of Arbitration. They created the International Court of Justice, so they fund that through UN dues. These countries who signed off on the treaty contribute to maintain the administration of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. That's the job. And you constantly become a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, a member state. I found out it was actually Palestine. Palestine ratified the treaty in 2015, but the United States was blocking Palestine's membership with Israel and Canada. 3 countries in the meeting, and what the United States was using as a means to object to Palestinian joining of the Permanent Court of Arbitration as a member was Palestine is not a member of the United Nations. So it's an entity not a member of the United Nations. Therefore, they cannot participate, cannot be a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. That's where it came from. Now, they had the vote, and the United States knew they couldn't win. They left the meeting, and it was voted unanimously. No objections. Palestine became a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So now let's revisit what the Secretary General just used. The Secretary General is supposed to be the head of a bureau that forms tribunals. They're supposed to be impartial, right? You're not supposed to be siding with anybody. You got to be impartial, you got to be neutral. This Secretary General was actually representing the United States and protecting them in these proceedings, because the Secretary General cannot operate outside of the Hague Convention. That means this Secretary General has just been exposed as an agent for the United States at the highest level of the court. That's huge. That's a political bomb right there. China, Russia, they're also members of the court. Okay, so the Permanent Court of Arbitration was created by treaty. So you have 121 countries that ratified the treaty. So if you go to the website, Permanent Court of Arbitration, you can list, it'll show you the current member states, 121 of them. United States joined it right after 1899. These countries serve on what is called the Administrative Council. So their diplomats that they have in The Hague sit on this Administrative Council on administrative purposes. Their job, they actually control and direct the International Bureau within the convention. You cannot be partisan, because you're talking sovereign states, and many of these 122 countries do not like each other and may have disputes between each other, like Philippines and China, right, on the South China Sea, or Ukraine and Russia. They're still members of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, member states. So the Secretary General, who is elected for 5 years by the Administrative Council, has to ensure that the International Bureau is neutral, is not biased, and all they do is administrative issues, that's all. They do not do anything political, they cannot, because it would reflect upon the country or the countries themselves. They have to be impartial. So they see a dispute, all they got to determine, is it a state or not a state? If it's a state, form the tribunal. Get arbitrators to step in. So for the Secretary General to do what he did and to be evasive and not even to meet is telling, because if he did meet with my deputy agent from Italy, my deputy agent would have said, what are you referring to regarding recent pronouncements of member states? What will have naturally come out was Israel, Canada, and the United States. Once that comes out, this is bias. Now you're an agent for the United States. You're now protecting them in these proceedings. You're not saying, the Secretary General did not say the Hawaiian Kingdom doesn't exist. He said entities that are not members of the United Nations. Well, that was an argument made by the United States against Palestine, which failed. Now, this thing doesn't apply to us in 2 ways. Number one, we're not seeking to become a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. We're not like Palestine, approved the treaty to be a member. We're not. We are considered under Article 47 of the Hague Convention, which the Permanent Court of Arbitration already verified, as a non-contracting power. You have contracting powers called 122 countries and non-contracting powers. So there was a case when our case was going on, few years before us. It was Italy versus Costa Rica. Costa Rica was recognized as a non-contracting power because they weren't a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. In 1999, after the proceedings, Costa Rica became a contracting power. They were like Palestine. They joined the Permanent Court. So you can have cases from contracting or non-contracting powers. All the records there. So, travel to The Hague to address this, and a formal complaint was received, and I can't say which country, but we met with an embassy in The Hague, and I was received as an ambassador at large for the Hawaiian Kingdom, and they acknowledged receipt of a formal complaint against the Secretary General. That's huge. If anything, what the Secretary General did, help us. We're going to take it to another level now. Now we're taking it to all 122 countries. And we're also going to take it to all 193 countries at the UN. In that meeting that I had, we not only requested this country to receive the complaint and cause a meeting, invoke a meeting of the Administrative Council, which can take place within 48 hours, but also to request that this country report to the United Nations the prolonged occupation of Hawaii under Article 48 of the Articles of State Responsibility for Internationally Wrongful Acts. That is what Rwanda offered us back 17 years ago in December. This country is now asked to do the same thing, but we're also addressing the issue of the case. So, in conclusion, I can tell you things are definitely moving, right? But there are things of procedure, and there are things of things that I cannot say because that's confidential. We're still in negotiations, and I was asked by this country's embassy to keep things bilateral and confidential. And I can tell you that we've already seen actions taken outside, because if I tell you who the country is, you would know what I'm talking about. But I gotta keep it confidential. The one thing that is clear though, we're gonna have to hold back on the hearing of January 16th and 17th and probably move it to March. Because the reason why you have a hearing is after you submit the paperwork to the commission to review, then you have oral hearings. And all of this that I shared with you is because of what happened in 1843, November 28th. Ha'alileo, Richards, and Simpson. That's really why all this happened and is happening. And that's why we need to continue to be educated. Don't play politics, just get educated. Talk to your family, normalize the conversations. Yeah? Teachers are already learning it, they're teaching already. My book, Uamaukea, is now the history book at Kamehameha School's Kapalama campus. So these things are moving. And we're here to honor those men back then in 1843 for what they did. And that's why this is La Kuʻokoʻa, Independence Day. Any questions? Yes, Ulu, my classmate from Kamehameha. Remember the 3 points that I had here? This is what the commission will be looking at. What will the commissioners be looking at? What will they be addressing in the proceedings? So the question was, what are the commissioners actually going to be looking at? War crimes, this and that. They're going to be answering, they got to answer these questions. But you need to have a fact-finding process first. But you also they have to be given the context of what's going on. First, what is the function and role of the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom under humanitarian law? So we're asking them as a fact finder, what is our role? What is our responsibility, right? Second phase, what are the duties and obligations of the government toward Lance Larson? He's the whole centerpiece of these proceedings. But by extension, what about other Hawaiian subjects that live in Hawaii and live abroad? What about them? And then we also asked the third question, what are the duties and obligations of the government toward protected persons? Let's say Japanese citizens, not Americans. See, Americans are not protected persons because they're the citizenry of the occupier. So protected persons are citizens of the occupied state and any other citizenry. Japanese citizens, Chinese citizens coming in to visit. Yeah. So the first phase or the first issue is what is the function and role of the government first. That's what's going to be addressed with the commission. So you have to submit paperwork called statement of facts that provide them the context, right? So that's what this is. The parties undertake to supply the Commission of Inquiry as fully as they may think possible with all means and facilities necessary to enable it to become completely acquainted with and to accurately understand the facts in question. Once we submit the paperwork, that's why I got my deputy agent, Federico Lenzerini from Italy, and the guy from the Matrix. Once we submit that information, those facts, which could be quite voluminous, then we need to have a hearing on these facts. Once they answer that first question, then we can move to the second question. Then we can move to the third question. This is the first question. Now, if the Secretary General did not do what he did, this would have made news all over the world about the Hawaiian Kingdom and the role of the Hawaiian government. So what we found is the United States could not do it overtly, right? They had to do it through an agent. And they basically infiltrated the highest level of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. That's huge. And other countries will not like that. They're already seeing that. But for us, we're not here to bring down the Secretary General. My meeting that I had in The Hague, let's just fix the problem. We're moving toward this proceedings. That's all we are. Whatever the Secretary General did, it's on his shoulders. Whatever you guys want to do about him, that's up to you guys. I'm not there as an expert witness or as a witness to his dereliction of duty. I'm just saying, he violated it, let's fix it so we can move on. But now when we ask that country itself to go to the next level, called the United Nations, okay, now we're going to take it to another level while we're still working with Lance Larson. Yeah. Good question. So the question is Lance Larson still running around with those plates? And what should we do? Da, da, da. Okay, he's not doing that because he already made the point. No sense killing yourself to prove a point. He already proved it. We're at the international level. It's called survival. It's called necessity. What I recommend all you folks do, don't get political. Just get educated. Learn these issues. I'm not activating political people. I'm trying to expose people to education and knowledge. We're doing it at the university, high schools. Well, the community has to be educated as well. So that's what's important. So we got one more question, and then we got to make it to a break. Two more questions. Okay. Okay. So the laws of citizenship. This is how it works. Under Hawaiian Kingdom law, there are 3 ways to acquire Hawaiian citizenship during a state of peace, right? Natural born, you can be born on the territory, like Sanford Dole. His parents were American, but he was born as a Hawaiian subject, natural born. Also, you can be naturalized. There's a time period for residency. Then you apply to the Minister of the Interior for naturalization. And third, you can be born abroad of Hawaiian national parents. Let's say they're traveling in Great Britain, a child is born in London, that child may be British by birth, but also Hawaiian by parentage. So that's a dual citizen. Just one. Now, during the state of war, remember things change now, right? During a state of war, you can only acquire citizenship of an occupied state one way. You gotta be a direct descendant by parentage from a Hawaiian subject before the occupation began. So before January 17, 1893, if you were a Hawaiian subject by birth, naturalization, or born abroad, and you're a direct descendant, you're a Hawaiian subject today, irrespective of your race, color, creed. International law prevents acquiring citizenship in an occupied state by naturalization. Why? Because there's no government there, right? It's the occupier that administers the laws. And second, born on the territory. If you're born within the territory of an occupied state, you don't acquire the citizenship of the occupied state. Otherwise, the occupier is going to flood the country with their own nationals to give birth and overwhelm the national population, which is precisely what the United States did. That's when all of a sudden we became a minority in Hawaii, Native Hawaiians. But Native Hawaiians or one group, which is 87% of the national population, you still have 13% that are non-natives, right? Like descendants of Lauren Thurston, descendant of Chinese who were naturalized or born within Hawaiian territory. So it's not an ethnic question. So people should do their genealogy and to find out if anybody in their family, whether a mother or father, was born within the Hawaiian Kingdom before January 17th or was naturalized before January 17th. Then that would make you a Hawaiian subject today. But we wouldn't know for sure until we have a census report done, which it'll be qualified exactly who are Hawaiian subjects. But this is just a rule of thumb, you might say. And then one question here. Last one. Okay. Because Kali we gotta take a break so you guys can eat lau lunch. Okay. First people? No, the insurgents were the provisional government, 1893. See, insurgency are people who commit high treason. No, the provisional government in Hawaii was made up of about 30 people. Included Hawaiian subjects, American citizens, Germans, even British. They were insurgents. So the word insurgent is a person who commits the high crime of treason. That's why when you watch CNN, they talk about the insurgency. So whenever you see insurgency, that means criminals.
So they were the people that the 500 troops were against.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Also, who was Marshall Wilson?
Marshal Charles Wilson was the marshal, like the lead sheriff for law enforcement throughout the islands. Marshal Charles Wilson actually wasn't even native. He wasn't Kanaka Maoli or Hapa. He was actually half Tahitian, half Haole, but he was Hawaiian. So again, that's an example of nationality, not ethnicity. Yeah.
There's 118 military installations in the archipelago.
Yeah.
118.
Yeah, that's from the U.S. Department of Defense report.
The largest Hawaii with the most military installations
Per square mileage.
in any other state,
Right.
any other area,
Right.
any other archipelago.
It appears so.
Very, very militarized state we live in.
Yeah, we just got used to it.
I guess I have one more question. Did you write a history book?
Yeah, that's the book Ua Mauke'ea. So the history book, so you know what you do? Go Google Dr. Keanu Sai. Google Dr. Keanu Sai. It'll take you to my UH website. That's the one, hawaii.edu. Just look at the URL. Go to publications. Just go to publications on my UH website, and it'll take you to the book Ua Mauke'ea, Sovereignty Endures, the legal and political history of Hawaii. Hit that link. It'll take you to the publisher to purchase it, because I don't sell it. That's the publisher that takes care of that. I actually live here, but I teach on Oahu. Yeah. Okay, I want to thank you guys for being a part of this presentation. I hope I provide some context for information to follow from others who have done their research. And with that, mahalo nui.
Okay, I think Dr. Sai made up for the 19 minutes that I went over on his time.